She's crying again. Ronan Ashcombe said it the way a man says it's raining flat, unbothered, already turning away. He didn't lower his voice, didn't care who heard. 3 members of his household staff stood 6 feet away, and not one of them moved. Sorrel stood in the hallway, with her hands pressed together in front of her. Tears she hadn't meant to let out sliding down her face. She had waited 40 minutes for a 2-minute conversation. She had practiced what to say. She had told herself this time would be different. Let her cry. He walked back into his office and closed the door. And Laurel, the woman who had kept every corner of that estate running for 3 years, who remembered every birthday, every allergy, every person's quiet grief, pressed her back against the wall, swallowed the sound trying to come out of her throat, and whispered to no one. Okay, 6 hours later, nobody could find her. If you've ever been told your pain was an inconvenience, stay. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the end. Hit like and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning it happened started the same way. Every morning started at the Ashcombe estate. Before anyone else woke up, Laurel was already moving. She was up by 5:15, not because anyone required it of her, not because there was a schedule pinned to a board with her name on it. She was up because she had learned slowly, over 3 years of living inside this particular world, that the hours before 6 a.m. were the only hours that belonged entirely to her, and even then she spent most of them thinking about everyone else. She made coffee the way Ronan liked it, even though Ronan rarely came down for breakfast anymore. Dark, 2 sugars, a splash of something that wasn't technically in any recipe, but that she'd figured out through observation, the same way she figured out most things about him. She set it at the far left corner of the kitchen counter, where the sunlight hit it in a way that kept it warm longest. Then she went and checked on the orchids in the conservatory, because October was difficult for them, and because standing in that glass room in the early silence was the closest thing she had to prayer. She wasn't aware, standing there among the flowers, that her hands were shaking. She'd been ignoring the shaking for about 3 weeks. There were other things she'd been ignoring, too. The headaches that arrived without warning somewhere behind her left eye and didn't leave for hours. The vertigo that hit her. Sometimes, when she stood up too fast, a gray lurching sensation that forced her to grip the nearest surfaces and breathe through her nose until the world stopped tilting. The way food had stopped tasting like much of anything. The way sleep, when she got it, left her feeling hollowed out rather than rested. She told herself she was tired. She told herself everyone was tired. She had a list on her phone, an actual literal list of things she'd been meaning to do for herself. Schedule a doctor's appointment. Get blood work done. Call her sister back. The list had been sitting unread under 17 notifications for 6 weeks, and every time she opened it, something else needed handling first. That morning, it was the cinnamon rolls. There was a bakery in the city 40 minutes out that made the only cinnamon roll Ronan had ever eaten twice. Laurel had noticed this 8 months ago during a breakfast she wasn't supposed to be managing at all. She'd started ordering them quietly, without saying anything, tucking them into the supply runs with the coffee and the flowers and the half-dozen other small things she sourced personally, because nobody else was paying close enough attention to know they mattered. Ronan never commented on them, but they kept disappearing. She took one from the bag that had arrived the previous afternoon and set it on a small plate near the coffee. Then she went upstairs to handle the morning briefing packets. Ronan liked organized before 7. She made it up 11 steps before the vertigo returned. She gripped the banister and stayed very still. Her vision did something complicated. Her heartbeat, for about 4 seconds, became a thing she could feel in her ears. Then it passed. She continued up the stairs. The Sultan. By 8 o'clock, she had organized the briefing packets, responded to 14 messages about the estate's ongoing renovation timeline, arranged medical transport for one of the older groundskeepers who'd been complaining about his knee, and reminded 2 of Ronan's security staff about their coverage rotation, without making it sound like a reminder. She was efficient in the way only people who have spent their lives making themselves useful learn to be quietly, completely, in a way that left no trace of effort. At 8:42, she knocked on Ronan's office door. He didn't answer. She knocked again. Come in. The office was large and very deliberately arranged. 2 windows. Bookshelves that held more security manuals than books. a desk that had never once had a personal photograph on it. Ronan was already on the phone, seated with his back partially turned, and he held up one finger at her without looking. She waited. 5 minutes. 7. 9. At 11 minutes, he ended the call and turned in his chair, and his expression was the expression of a man who was already somewhere else in his head before this conversation had started. What? Not a question. A slot he was clearing in his schedule out of duty. Laurel had her hands clasped in front of her. She'd been holding what she wanted to say for 3 days, rearranging it, looking for the version that would land right. That wouldn't sound like a complaint. That would make it easy for him to hear. I wanted to talk to you about something. Not estate business. It's personal. Something behind his eyes shifted, closed slightly. I've got a call in 18 minutes. I know, I won't take long. He waited. The way he waited was itself a kind of pressure, not hostile exactly, but compressed like a room with slightly too little oxygen. Ronan Ashcombe had spent 20 years building an empire on the understanding that time was the single resource he could not recover, and that understanding had become so deeply embedded in him that even his silences communicated it. Laurel felt the tears coming before she'd said a single word about why she was there, and she hated herself for it. She wasn't a crier by nature. She was practical. She was the person who held things together while other people cried. But the past month had worn something down inside her, some structural element she hadn't realized was load-bearing until it began to go, and the combination of his expression and her own exhaustion, and the fact that she'd been trying to say this for 3 days, collapsed something she'd been holding very carefully upright. Her eyes filled. She blinked hard. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I don't want to do this. Ronan's jaw tightened. Not with concern. With something that looked a great deal like impatience. He stood, straightened his jacket, and moved toward the door in the particular way he moved when a conversation had ended, before he'd declared it over. Ronan, not now, Laurel. I said it's important. He turned. She was right behind him, closer than she'd meant to be, and the tears had made it onto her cheeks now without her permission. And she watched him look at her face, and she watched something happen in his expression, not softening, not opening, but something more like a door being confirmed shut. And he said, loud enough that Mavis in the hallway could hear it, loud enough that 2 of the morning security staff passing the far end of the corridor could hear it, she's crying again. He said it to no one in particular. He said it the way you say. The dog's barking again, or the neighbor's alarm is going off again, with the specific tiredness of someone describing an inconvenience that recurs without resolution. Then he looked past her, rather than at her, and he said the other part, let her cry. And he walked back to his desk and picked up his phone. Laurel stood in the doorway. She was aware of Mavis somewhere behind her, of the 2 men at the end of the hall who had very deliberately turned to look at a wall. She was aware of the tears on her face and of the specific physical sensation of swallowing a sound, the particular muscular effort of forcing grief back down your own throat. She thought, he'll call me in when he's off the phone. He'll realize. He'll come find me. She thought, tomorrow will be different. She took a slow breath. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs. She smiled not because she felt anything that resembled a smile, but because smiling was the face she put on when she was deciding that her own pain could wait, and she said, to the empty doorway, to the space where a response might have lived, okay. Then she went back downstairs. She straightened the briefing packets that didn't need straightening. She refilled the coffee that nobody had touched yet. She went into the conservatory and stood among the orchids she'd been tending for 2 years and pressed her forehead against the cold glass wall and let herself cry for exactly 4 minutes because she'd gotten very precise about her allowances. Then she wiped her face. She found a clean plate. She set the cinnamon roll on it, Ronan's cinnamon roll, the one she'd ordered from 40 minutes away, because she'd noticed he liked it twice, and she carried it toward his office, because even now, even still, her first thought after crying was whether he'd eaten. She got halfway there. The vertigo came back. This one was different. This one had weight behind it, a full-body heaviness, a sudden certainty that her legs were not entirely connected to her decision-making, a gray wall rising at the edges of her vision that moved inward very quickly. She turned. She needed to sit down. She made it to the conservatory. She made it to the wooden bench between the orchids. She sat down. The cinnamon roll, still in its plate, landed beside her. Then the gray wall finished moving, and everything went quiet. Ronan was 20 minutes into a call about a shipment dispute when his door opened without a knock. He looked up. His lieutenant, Declan, not a man who came in without knocking, ever was standing in the frame with an expression Ronan did not like. "We have a problem. I'm on a call. It's Laurel." Ronan ended the call. He would not examine later how quickly he ended it. He would not examine the specific quality of the alarm that moved through him in that moment, animal, immediate, bypassing every layer of professional composure he'd spent decades constructing. He simply ended the call and stood. What happened? She's not answering. We can't. Nobody's seen her in about an hour. Ronan was already moving. He told himself it was operational concern. He told himself what he was doing was threat assessment, not panic. That the right response to an unexplained absence in an estate like his was immediate security escalations, because kidnapping and retaliation were genuine possibilities, and he had genuine enemies who were not above using the people closest to him. He told himself he was being practical. He gave Declan 6 instructions in under 30 seconds. Lock down the perimeter, pull the surveillance feeds from the last 90 minutes, get eyes on all access points, confirm nobody had left the property, locate her phone, check every room. The phone was found in the kitchen. It was sitting beside an untouched cup of tea that had gone cold. Ronan looked at the phone for longer than he would have liked. Laurel did not go anywhere without her phone. Not because she was attached to it, she wasn't, the way some people were, but because people needed to reach her. She'd told him once, almost despairingly, that she couldn't stand the thought of someone having a problem she could have fixed if she'd only been available. He picked the phone up, set it down, left the kitchen. They found her in the conservatory. She was lying on the wooden bench, the way a person lies when their body has made a decision. Their mind didn't get a vote on completely. Boneless, still, the particular stillness that doesn't look like sleep, because sleep has movement in it, the small adjustments of a body, still engaged with being alive. The orchids were around her. The October light was coming through the glass at a low angle. Beside her, on a plate that had stayed upright by some logic of its own, was a cinnamon roll. Ronan went still in the doorway. He'd spent his adult life cultivating stillness as a strategic tool. He'd stood in rooms where men threatened his life and not moved a muscle. He'd looked at catastrophe without blinking because blinking cost you information. The stillness he felt now was not that kind. This was the stillness of a man who has looked at something and understood in a single unmediated second that he did not want what he was seeing to be real. "Call an ambulance," he said. His voice came out wrong. Flat in a way that wasn't controlled flat. The way a voice goes when it's running on something other than feeling, when the feeling has gotten too large for the body that's supposed to contain it. He crossed the conservatory, crouched beside the bench, and put 2 fingers against Laurel's throat. Her pulse was there, faint, irregular. There, he exhaled. He did not let himself think about the 6 hours between her standing in his doorway, with tears on her face in this moment. He did not let himself calculate the arithmetic of what might have been different. He stayed beside her, keeping his fingers against her pulse, until the ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, and then he followed it to the hospital in the car, because the alternative, waiting, not knowing, being somewhere else, while this continued without him, was not a thing he was capable of choosing. The emergency physician's name was Dr. Clara Mwende, and she was professional and thorough, and had clearly worked in rooms with men like Ronan before, because she did not seem particularly intimidated by the fact that he was standing at the far end of the intake corridor, with his arms folded and an expression that had made grown men reconsider their choices. She came to him after 40 minutes. Ronan had spent those 40 minutes running through scenarios, contingencies, threats, vectors. He'd been poisoned before an associate 8 years ago, slipped something into a drink at a business dinner. He'd been targeted through the people close to him. He knew how these things worked. He had prepared himself, as much as a person can prepare themselves for information that required action. Dr. Mwende folded her hands in front of her and said, "She's stable." She collapsed from severe physical exhaustion, combined with significant dehydration, nutritional deficiencies consistent with irregular eating over several months, and what looks like a vitamin deficiency that's been developing for a while. Her blood pressure when she came in was low enough that we were concerned. There's no indication of foul play or external cause. Ronan looked at her. Her body, Dr. Mwende continued, with the careful precision of someone who has explained things to powerful people and knows that precision matters more than cushioning, was running on empty. This wasn't sudden. The signs have been there for some time. I'd estimate she's been managing active symptoms for at least 2 months, possibly longer. Symptoms, Ronan repeated. Fatigue, vertigo, headaches, possibly some cognitive fog. These are things that get worse slowly, and they tend to be the type of thing people who are very focused on other people ignore in themselves. Doctor. Mwende paused. Can I ask, was she seeing a physician regularly? Any recent appointments? Ronan opened his mouth. He closed it. He had no answer. He did not know when Laurel had last seen a doctor. He did not know if she had a doctor. He did not know. He realized with a specific and unpleasant clarity almost anything about the daily mechanics of Laurel's own life because in 3 years of living under the same roof, he understood her entirely as a person who took care of things, and he had not once extended to her the same attention she had extended to every other person inside those walls. I don't know, he said. Dr. Mwende nodded once, without judgment, in the way physicians learn to nod when a family member doesn't have an answer they should have. She'll need rest. Proper nutrition, fluids, follow-up blood work. The physical part we can address. She paused again. The harder part is making sure the conditions that led here change. Because this kind of exhaustion, the kind that bypasses a person's own self-preservation instinct that comes from somewhere. She left him with that. Ronan stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then he found Mavis. Mavis Aldridge had been managing the household for 11 years, which meant she had outlasted 3 organizational crises, 2 estate renovations, 1 federal inquiry that required everyone to be very careful about what they said for 8 months, and a rotating staff of approximately 40 people whose names she kept in her head without writing anything down. She was 63 and did not frighten easily. She was sitting in a waiting room chair with Laurel's jacket folded in her lap, and she looked up when Ronan came in, and she didn't say anything, just looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been waiting a long time for a particular conversation to happen. Ronan sat down across from her. Tell me, he said. Mavis pressed her lips together. She asked me not to say anything. Mavis, she said you had enough going on. The words landed in a specific way. Not like a blow, like a door opening onto something. Ronan hadn't known was behind it. Mavis reached into her bag and put a small journal on the seat between them. She'd want me to burn this, probably, Mavis said, but you need to see it. Ronan looked at the journal. It was small, dark green, the cover worn soft at the corners. He picked it up. The first entry was from 14 months ago. Good day. Everyone seems okay. Ronan ate dinner, which he hasn't done 3 nights running, so that's something. He kept reading. Need to make an appointment. Have that weird dizziness again. Probably just not drinking enough water. We'll handle it this week. 3 weeks later, forgot to call the doctor. There was the thing with the East kitchen deliveries, and then the sourcing issue with the kitchen deliveries, and by the time I remembered, it was after hours. We'll try again. Monday. Monday, Ronan had that meeting that ran 6 hours, so I pushed everything to handle coverage, and then it was Tuesday. He read the whole journal. It took him 22 minutes. There were entries about everyone. An aging groundskeeper who needed his knee looked at. A young security hire who Laurel suspected was sending most of his paycheck home and didn't have enough left for decent boots. She had, quietly, arranged for a supply update that put better equipment in his hands without drawing attention to why. Mavis' birthday remembered and marked a month in advance. The name of the sick relative of someone on the night rotation, with a note to follow up, and woven through all of it in smaller handwritings, lighter, pressure, as though she were writing the entries in the margins of her own life. Dizzy again. Head bad today, but pushed through. Didn't eat much. Will do better tomorrow. Cried in the conservatory this morning. Needed that, back now. He didn't open the door. That's okay. He's busy. He didn't open the door again. It's fine. I'll try again tomorrow. Tomorrow will be different. Ronan closed the journal. He sat for a long time with his hands flat on his knees. Outside the waiting room window, October was doing what October does, stripping things back, reducing the world to its essential shapes. The trees were half empty. The light was thin and honest. He thought about this morning. He thought about the hallway, and the way she had stood there with her hands pressed together in front of her, and the tears that had come out of her face, and what he had said. He heard it again in his head, the way certain sounds replay themselves exactly, without mercy, with perfect pitch. She's crying again. He thought about the cinnamon roll on the plate beside her unconscious body in the conservatory. She had been trying to bring it to him when she fell. He had dismissed her, humiliated her, in front of people she worked alongside every day, told a household full of staff that her pain was something to be left alone, and her response had been to carry his breakfast to his office anyway. Ronan Ashcombe put his face in his hands. He was not a man who did that. He was not, as a rule, a man who let his body acknowledge what was happening inside it in any visible way. He'd built his entire life on the foundation of that discipline. But there was nobody in the waiting room except Mavis, and Mavis, to her credit, said nothing. She just put the jacket that had been on her lap onto the seat beside him in case he was cold, and looked out the window and gave him the same quiet she'd always given the people in her care. After a while, Ronan straightened. He put the journal carefully into his jacket pocket. "How long?" he said. "Have you known she was struggling?" Mavis didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Since August. She made me promise." "You should have told me anyway." Mavis looked at him directly. "I told her the same thing." She stopped. Started again. "She said she didn't want you to feel like she was a problem you had to solve. She said you had enough of those." The words were quiet. "They did a great deal of damage anyway." "She wasn't asking you to solve anything," Mavis added. "She just wanted you to look at her long enough to ask." Ronan said nothing. He sat in table. He sat in the hospital waiting room with Laurel's journal in his pocket and the October light coming through the window, and he thought about all the doors he hadn't opened, and all the mornings he'd checked his watch instead of his people, and the specific arithmetic of 3 years of tomorrows that had never arrived. His phone vibrated. Business. Decisions requiring him. Men waiting. He silenced it. He stayed where he was. The hospital had a particular smell that Ronan associated with bad decisions. Not illness. Exactly, not antiseptic, though there was plenty of that. So it was something underneath those things, a specific quality of air that accumulated in places where people sat with the consequences of what they had and hadn't done, where time moved differently because the normal rules of a managed life had been suspended. He'd been in hospitals before. He'd sat in corridors like this one, waiting on information about men who'd been shot, men who'd been beaten, men who'd made the mistake of being in the wrong place during the wrong negotiation. He'd always been able to separate himself from those rooms. He'd always had somewhere else his mind could be. Tonight his mind would not go anywhere else. He'd asked Mavis to go home around 9 o'clock. She'd refused. In the particular way, Mavis refused things, not arguing, just not moving, and eventually he'd stopped asking. She was in the chair across the corridor with a cup of vending machine coffee she hadn't touched, and neither of them had spoken in over an hour. And somehow that was the closest thing to comfort Ronan had available to him. At 10:40 a nurse came out and told him Laurel was stable, resting, and that he could see her briefly if he wanted. He stood up too fast, caught himself. "Briefly," he said, like the word needed confirmation. "She's sedated. She won't be aware you're there." He nodded and followed the nurse down a corridor that smelled like every other corridor, past rooms that held their own disasters behind half-closed doors, and into a room at the end that was dim and quiet and smaller than he expected. Laurel looked wrong in a hospital bed. That was his first thought, not medically, not strategically, but aesthetically, viscerally wrong, the way something looks when it's in a context so far outside its natural one that the wrongness is physical. Laurel belonged in motion. She belonged in the margins of every room. The person you noticed was there only when she stopped being there. She had a quality of energy that was quiet rather than loud but present in every space she occupied. Here in this bed, with monitors attached to her and an IV line running into her arm and the institutional lighting, doing what institutional lighting does to a person's color, she looked reduced, smaller. He sat in the chair beside her bed. He did not touch her hand. He almost did, reached out, stopped. He didn't have the right to do that now, he thought. Or maybe he did, and that was the problem. No, maybe he'd always had the right, and had simply never sarzeked it, had kept himself at a deliberate distance because closeness required attention, and attention required time he'd told himself he didn't have. The monitor beside her beeped at steady intervals. He counted the beeps. He got to 67 before he stopped counting. On the bedside table, some nurse or orderly had placed the few things from Laurel's pockets when she'd been brought in: a folded piece of paper, a lip balm, a small stone, smooth and pale, that looked like something she'd picked up somewhere and kept. He stared at the stone for a long time. He had no idea where it had come from. He had no idea what it meant to her. He'd lived in the same building as this woman for 3 years, and there were objects in her pockets whose entire history was invisible to him. He picked the folded paper up. He shouldn't. He knew that. He unfolded it anyway. It was a letter, handwritten in Laurel's particular script, tight and slightly left-leaning, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to write fast so they could get back to whatever they were supposed to be doing. It was addressed to him. Ronan, I've started this 4 times. I keep stopping because I don't know how to say it without it sounding like a complaint, and I'm not complaining. I want to be clear about that from the start. What I have here, the work, the people, the place, I wouldn't trade it. But lately I've been lying awake thinking about something I can't figure out how to put down. So I'm going to try. You're one of the most exhausting people I've ever met. Not in a bad way. In the way a storm is exhausting, you're constant, you're forceful, and being near you requires something. I don't mind that. I've never minded that. What I mind is this. I think you believe that asking for help means you failed at something. I think you've been carrying things alone for so long that you don't even notice the weight anymore. And I think the people around you, the ones who care about you, not just the ones who work for you, we pick up the pieces you drop without telling you, because telling you feels like accusing you of something. I'm not accusing you of anything. I just want you to know that you don't have to carry all of it. Not alone. Not all the time. There are people right here who would... The letter stopped mid-sentence. The pen had simply lifted and not come back down. The rest of the page was blank. Ronan read the letter twice. Then he folded it exactly the way it had been folded and put it back on the table, aligned carefully with the edge, and pressed his palms flat against his thighs and looked at the wall on the far side of the room for a long time. She'd written it and not finished it. She'd carried it in her pocket for how long? Days? Weeks? And hadn't given it to him. She'd stood in his doorway that morning trying to say something, and when he'd shut, she'd gone back downstairs and carried his cinnamon roll toward his office anyway. And somewhere in the space between those two things, her body had made a decision that her sense of duty wouldn't let her make herself. A nurse appeared in the doorway and said that he should let her rest. Ronan stood, looked at Laurel's face, still pale, the vertical lines between her brows present even in sedated sleep, as though some part of her couldn't fully let go of the effort even now. He thought, I'm going to fix this. Then he thought, that's exactly what she said you'd say, that you'd want to solve it, that that's not what she was asking for. He left the room. He did not sleep that night. By 6 a.m. he was back at the estate, and by 6:15 Declan was in the kitchen across from him with a mug of coffee and the carefully neutral expression of a man who had learned over 12 years of service that neutrality was sometimes the only safe option. Declan was 44, Boston Irish, compact in the way people who grew up scrapping get compact, all of it functional, nothing decorative. He'd been with Ronan since before the organization became what it currently was, which meant he'd seen things that most of the current staff hadn't, and he had a loyalty that was not the bought kind. He also occasionally told Ronan things Ronan didn't want to hear, which was the quality Ronan had come to value most. Tell me about the wellness program, Ronan said. Declan set his mug down. Which one? The one somebody brought to me about a year ago. Medical coverage expansion, mental health access, mandatory check-ins. Ronan paused. I don't remember reading the full proposal. Declan was quiet for a moment. You didn't, he said. Read the full proposal. Who brought it? Another pause, shorter but deliberate. Laurel put it together. She flagged it to me first because she didn't. She wasn't sure it was the kind of thing to bring directly to you without running it by someone first. He stopped. I brought it to you in the middle of the Marchetti situation. You looked at the first page, said it wasn't the right time, and we moved on. The Marchetti situation had been 14 months ago. Ronan had spent 14 months not implementing a program that the woman currently in a hospital bed from physical neglect, had put together specifically to prevent people from ending up in hospital beds from physical neglect. He breathed through his nose. "Get me the full proposal," he said. "Whatever version still exists." "I kept a copy," Declan said it without inflection. He'd kept a copy. Of course he had. "I want everything implemented by end of month. Medical examinations for all estate staff and the legitimate company employees. Paid healthcare with no deductible threshold. Counseling access on the clock, no documentation required. Mandatory rest periods that are actually enforced, not just written into a handbook." Ronan paused. "And whatever the vacation leave minimum is, double it." Declan was writing on the notepad he always carried. He wrote without comment, which was itself a comment. Also, Ronan said, "I want to know who else on this property has been managing something they haven't told me about. Medical, personal, financial, anything." Quietly, without making it a formal review, Declan looked up. "That's going to be a long list," he said. "I know. You want me to handle it. Like what? Like a security audit? I want you to handle it like a person asking if other people are okay. Can you do that?" Declan's expression shifted, just slightly. He was not a man who showed surprise easily, but something moved across his face before he got it back under control. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." After Declan left, Ronan went to the conservatory. He didn't entirely know why. The room still held the shape of the previous afternoon, the bench where she'd been found, the orchids undisturbed, the October light coming through at a flatter angle now that the morning was still early. There was a small plate on the floor near the bench that someone had picked up and set aside. He crouched and looked at it. Still had the faint ghost of powdered sugar on its surface. He stood there for a while. Then he went to the security office on the east side of the estate and sat down in front of the surveillance system with a staff member who had the good sense not to ask questions and started pulling footage. He started with the past month. He told himself he was looking for anything that constituted a threat, something external, some explanation that existed outside of himself, that there had been a stressor he hadn't known about, a specific incident, something that had caused the accumulation rather than being the accumulation itself. What he found was worse. The cameras covered the interior corridors, the kitchen, the common areas, the exterior of his office. The footage was routine, days of routine. And in the middle of all that routine, Laurel, he watched her work. He watched her work the way a man watches something, allows himself to see it clearly, when he finally allows himself to see it without the filtering lens of assumption, without the shorthand that replaces observation when you think you already know what you're looking at. She was everywhere in that footage. Early morning, late night, the hours in between. She moved through the estate the way water moves, finding the lowest point, the greatest need, the place where she was most required. He watched her bring coffee to a guard at 3 in the morning who'd been on an extended shift. He watched her sit with one of the kitchen workers for 20 minutes, in a corner of the break room, not talking, just present, the worker's head slightly bowed, Laurel's hand briefly on the woman's shoulder. He watched her fix a collar on a young man's jacket before he walked into a meeting, so quick and natural that the man barely registered it had happened, and he watched her outside his office. There were 7 separate instances across the past month. 7 times Laurel had stood in the corridor outside his door. Sometimes she had something in her hands, coffee, paperwork, once the folded letter he'd found in her pocket. Sometimes she had nothing. She would stop, stand. In 2 of the recordings, she visibly pressed her hand flat against the door, without knocking, a gesture so private he felt like an intruder watching it, and in both of those instances he had been able to hear, on the audio, whatever was happening on the other side. A phone call, a meeting, voices. And in both of those instances, Laurel had stood there for a long moment, and then she had straightened her spine and turned and walked back the way she'd come. In one recording, the most recent one, 4 days ago, she had knocked. He heard it on the audio. 3 knocks, measured, patient. A wait. Then 3 more. Then silence. Then, after nearly 2 minutes, Laurel had put both palms flat against his door, leaned her forehead against the wood, and stayed there for several seconds, and then she had turned and walked away. Ronan did not remember hearing a knock 4 days ago. He was certain, with the particular certainty of a man who has just realized something about himself, he cannot unrealize that he had heard it. That, somewhere in the machinery of that day, he had registered the knock and categorized it as interruptible and returned to whatever had seemed more urgent. "Stop the feed," he said. The staff member stopped it. "Leave," Ronan said. He was alone in the room for a long time. The confrontation with Declan happened that afternoon. It wasn't what Ronan intended when he called Declan back in. He'd intended a logistics conversation, the implementation timeline, the proposal details, the staff review. He got 6 minutes into that before something else pushed through the surface. "You knew," Ronan said. "Not just about the proposal. You knew she wasn't doing well." Declan set the folder on the desk. "I suspected," he said carefully. "That's the same thing." "With respect, it's not. You suspected that someone in this house was deteriorating, and you didn't tell me." Declan's jaw set. He had a tell. It was the only one Ronan had ever identified in him. This slight hardening along the jaw that appeared when he was deciding how honest to be. "She asked me not to," he said. "Same as she asked Mavis." Ronan stopped. Started again. "She's not your commanding officer, Declan. You work for me. Your obligation is to this organization, yeah." Declan's voice went flat. "And I take that seriously. You know I do. But she's not a security risk. She's a person who was struggling and asked me to stay out of it, and I made a call." He paused. "I made the wrong call. I know that now. But I made it because he stopped. Finish it." "Because I've watched you dismiss her for a year," Declan said. "Not cruelly. You're not a cruel man. But systematically. Every time she came to you with something that wasn't directly organizational, you were already elsewhere von Protein. And he exhaled hard through his nose. "I figured if she told you she was struggling, you'd fix the logistics of it and miss the actual problem. The way you fix everything." The room went quiet. Ronan looked at Declan for a long moment. "You thought I'd be useless," he said. "I thought you wouldn't know how to show up for her the way she needed. That's different." Declan held eye contact. He didn't flinch, which was one of the things Ronan had always respected about him. "I was probably right about that then." The word then sat between them. Ronan did not respond immediately. He turned to the window. Outside, the estate's grounds crew was doing their afternoon work, 2 men raking leaves from the far lawn, unhurried, talking between themselves, their voices inaudible through the glass. Ordinary men having an ordinary afternoon. "Cancel the Brennan meeting," Ronan said. "That's been rescheduled twice already." "They're not going to." "Cancel it. Tell them I'm unavailable. For how long?" Ronan thought about the letter in his pocket. The sentence that didn't finish. "As long as necessary," he said. Declan picked up his folder. He was nearly at the door when Ronan said, "The surveillance footage. Pull the last 2 months and back it up somewhere, separate. I want a full review." Declan paused without turning around. "Of what specifically?" "Everything involving Laurel." "A beat." "That's going to take time," Declan said quietly. Not an objection. Something more like a warning. "I know what I'm asking for," Ronan said. "Do it." After the door closed, Ronan sat down and put the unfinished letter on the desk in front of him. "There are people right here who would what? Catch him? Help him? Simply stand beside him long enough that carrying things alone stopped being the only option?" He had not let anyone finish that sentence in 20 years. He had not noticed until now that Laurel had been trying to. Mavis arrived at the estate at 6 p.m. and found Ronan in the kitchen. He was attempting to make soup. He was not good at it. There were 3 pots on the stove in various states. A cutting board covered with vegetables that had been cut into pieces of completely different sizes, and an expression on his face that suggested he was applying the same problem-solving framework to soup that he applied to territorial negotiations and finding it insufficient. Mavis stood in the kitchen doorway. Ronan looked up. "The doctor said she needs nutrition. Specific things. I wrote them down." He held up a piece of paper covered in medical notations in his own handwriting. Mavis crossed the kitchen. She took the paper. She read it. She looked at the pots. "The onions need to be the same size," she said. "I'm aware the onions need to be the same size." "Then why—" "Mavis." She took the knife out of his hand and started cutting onions with the proficiency of someone who has done it approximately 10,000 times. Ronan remained at the counter beside her, and for a while neither of them said anything. "When does she get out?" Mavis asked. "Tomorrow, if the morning blood work looks right. Day after if it doesn't, and you're going to bring her home too." Mavis gestured at the kitchen with the knife. The soup isn't— "I'm not talking about the soup." Ronan was quiet. "She's going to come back, and she's going to look at everything the same way she always looks at everything, Mavis said, working the knife steadily. And her first thought is going to be what needs doing. That's who she is. You can't cut that out of her. She paused. What you can do is make sure she doesn't have to do it alone. I know that. Knowing and doing are different things. You know that better than most people. He moved to the other side of the counter and started sorting the vegetables she'd cut, not because it was necessary, but because standing still was becoming difficult. She wrote me a letter, he said. Mavis didn't stop cutting. I know, she didn't finish it. She wrote it 5 times, Mavis said. That's the one she got furthest on. Ronan processed this. Did you know what she was going to say? I knew what she was trying to say. Same thing she's been trying to say for a year. Mavis set the knife down and turned to look at him directly. She wanted you to see her, not what she does. Her, she said it plainly, without cruelty, the way you tell someone an obvious truth, when the obvious truth has somehow managed to go unseen. That's all she's ever wanted from you. 5 letters, 40 attempts at your door, 3 years of making herself essential, so you'd at least have to look at her while she was doing something useful. She picked the knife back up. It's a hard way to live. The kitchen smelled like onions and something beginning to be dinner, and outside the window the evening was coming in flat and gray across the grounds, and Ronan stood very still for a moment with both hands on the counter. I don't know how to do this, he said. What she needs. The being there without fixing it. I don't have a reference for that. I know you don't. I'm aware that's not a good enough reason. It's not a reason at all, Mavis said, not unkindly. It's a starting point. She moved the vegetables into the nearest pot. You learn it. The same way you learn everything else badly, at first, and then less badly. She handed him a wooden spoon. Stir, she said, and don't overthink it. At 9:47 that night, Declan knocked on the door of Ronan's study and came in without waiting. Ronan looked up from the desk. He had been reading through Laurel's program proposal, the full version, the one Declan had kept, and it was extraordinary, in the specific way that things are extraordinary when you finally allow yourself to read them properly. Thorough, carefully costed, specific without being bureaucratic. She had anticipated every objection and built a response into the proposal itself. It was the work of someone who understood the organization she'd built it for at a structural level, and who had also somehow built human beings into every calculation. We have a problem, Declan said. His voice had a quality Ronan recognized. Not urgency. Declan didn't do urgency. He did control directness, but something below urgency. Something that said, this is information you will not like. Tell me. The Brennan postponement. Declan sat down without being asked, which was itself a signal. He only sat uninvited when the news was bad enough that the formality of standing felt absurd. I made the call, and their response was, he paused. Connor Brennan took it as a signal. A signal of what? Weakness. The timing. You're not at the estate, you're at a hospital. Nobody knows exactly why. And the postponement comes 2 days after the Marchetti territory situation that we still haven't fully resolved. He's reading it as instability. Ronan leaned back. What's he doing with that reading? Talking. He's been on calls all afternoon. I've got partial intercepts from the Connolly crew that suggest Brennan is repositioning specifically around the Kensington corridor arrangement. The Kensington corridor arrangement was not a small thing. It represented 18 months of negotiated access that was worth, conservatively, several $1 million annually, and which kept 3 separate, potentially hostile organizations at an agreed distance. If Brennan was moving on it, the cascade of responses that would require was extensive, immediate, a sound like Greenwood Zackleen, and would demand sustained attention that Ronan had just told himself he was not going to give his phone for the foreseeable future. Declan watched him process this. I need to know, Declan said carefully, what you want me to do. Because the options are... I know the options, Ronan. Declan's voice dropped slightly. Not softer. More direct. If you let this run without a response, Brennan doesn't stop at the corridor. You know him well enough to know he'll keep pulling until something stops him. That means this gets bigger before it gets manageable. And if I respond the way he's expecting me to respond, I'm in 3 meetings tomorrow and 6 the day after, and the hospital doesn't see me for 2 weeks. Ronan paused, which is exactly what Brennan would also understand. Declan was quiet. He picked this moment deliberately, Ronan said. Yes. He knew about Laurel. I don't know how much he knows, but the timing suggests he knew enough that something had disrupted your attention. Someone in the information chain. Declan's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. We have a leak. The word sat in the room between them. A leak. Not a new problem. As organizational problems went in a network of Ronan's size and complexity, information moved through it the way blood moved through a body, and just as blood occasionally went where it wasn't supposed to go, so did intelligence. But a leak timed to a moment of personal vulnerability, exploited specifically to create strategic pressure at the moment of maximum distraction. That was not random. That was someone who knew the architecture. Someone close enough to see the timing. Pull everyone's access logs for the past 72 hours, Ronanson said. Full communication, intercepts where we have authorization. I want a list of anyone who knew about Laurel before the ambulance was called. That's a short list, I know. Start there. Declan nodded. He stood. The Brennan situation, he said. What do I tell them? Ronan looked at the proposal on his desk, at the letter in his pocket, at the stone he'd taken from the hospital bedside without not knowing why, which was sitting on the corner of his desk now, pale and smooth in the lamplight. He thought about the footage he'd watched, about 7 doors he hadn't opened, about a sentence that hadn't been finished. Tell them, he said, that I'll be in contact when I'm ready, not before. They won't like. I know what they won't like, Declan. His voice was quiet. Final. Tell them anyway. Declan left. Ronan sat alone with the lamp and the stone and the unfinished letter, and outside the walls of the Ashcombe estate the machinery of his world ground forward the way it always had, hungry, relentless, indifferent to whatever was happening, inside the man who ran it, and for the first time in his adult life, Ronan Ashcombe looked at all of it and chose deliberately to let it wait. He would deal with Brennan. He would find the leak. He would handle every one of the cascading consequences of being a man who ran the kind of organization he ran. But he would do it after he had stood in a hospital room and done the thing he had never once in his life done for another person, without it costing him something he resented losing. He would simply be there, without the phone, without the agenda, without the version of himself that had looked at a crying woman and seen an inconvenience. He picked up the stone, turned it over in his fingers. Tomorrow he would go back to the hospital, and this time he would not be waiting to leave. He was at the hospital by 7:15, not because he'd slept and woken early. He hadn't slept. He'd sat in the study until 2 a.m. reading Laurel's proposal in full, then moved to the kitchen and sat there because the study had started feeling like a room that was too full of the specific weight of his own thinking. A sound like green around 4 in the morning, he'd stopped and pretending he was going to sleep and made coffee and watched the grounds through the kitchen window while the estate came awake around him in its slow, institutional way, the night rotation handing off to the morning rotation, the kitchen staff arriving, the particular sounds of a large house resuming its daily mechanics. At 6, he went upstairs and changed. At 6:40, he was in the car. The hospital in the early morning had a different quality than the hospital at night. At night it was suspended, held still by the particular silence of people, waiting in the dark for morning to tell them something. In the early morning it moved, shifts changing, carts in corridors, a sound like green wood splitting, the institutional business of keeping people alive, conducted with the brisk efficiency of people who had made peace the weight of what they did by learning not to look at it too directly. Ronan moved through it without engaging any of it. He had the stone in his jacket pocket. He'd put it there without deciding to, the same way he'd taken it from the bedside table, an action that bypassed his deliberate mind entirely and came from somewhere he didn't have good language for. The nurse at the floor station recognized him. She'd been there the previous night when he'd left, and she had the look of someone who had seen many people sit in hospital corridors and had developed a fairly accurate read of which ones had earned their presence there and which ones were simply performing concern. She nodded him through without a word. Laurel was awake. He stopped in the doorway. She was sitting up, slightly against the raised back of the bed, not fully upright but no longer flat, and she was looking at the window, the thin morning light coming in gray, and honest across the blanket on her lap, with an expression that was very still and slightly turned inward. She hadn't heard him yet. She was somewhere in her own thoughts, and the quality of those thoughts, whatever they were, had taken the usual readiness out of her face. She looked tired in a way that sleep hadn't touched. She looked like someone who had been running a very long distance and had finally been forced to stop. Then she turned and saw him. Something happened in her face. Several things quickly, a sequence he read with more accuracy than he would have expected from himself. Surprise. Then something softer than surprise and harder to name. Then the reflex. The smile starting. The composure assembling itself. He watched her do it. He watched her start to become the version of herself she put on for other people. And something in his chest tightened in a way that was not comfortable. "You don't have to do that," he said. She stopped. The half-assembled smile sat on her face for a moment, uncertain of itself. And then it came apart, and she looked at him with an expression that was simply her face unmanaged, which was something he realized he had almost never seen. "Do what?" she said. Her voice was rough from sleep and dehydration, lower than usual. "Whatever you were about to do." He gestured vaguely at his own face, knowing it was insufficient. "You were going to tell me you were fine." She looked at him for a moment. "I was," she admitted. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed. He put the stone on the bedside table where it had been the night before. She looked at it. "You took that," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He considered that. "I don't know yet." She looked at the stone for another moment, then back at him. Her eyes were clear in the morning light, not medicated clear, but present, focused, the specific alertness of someone who has slept enough that the immediate fog has lifted and left them alone with their thoughts. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "Just arrived." "And last night?" He didn't answer immediately. "Mavis told me you stayed," Laurel said. "Until almost 11. Mavis should mind her own business." "Mavis never has." A pause. "Ronan." He looked at her. "You don't have to." She stopped. She pressed her lips together briefly, and he watched her choose between the easy version of what she was about to say and something harder. She chose harder. "You don't have to do penance." "That's not why I told Mavis to let you know if you asked." I'm not keeping score." "I know you're not." "Then why are you here at 7 in the morning looking like you haven't slept?" "Because I haven't slept." "Ronan." "Laurel." His voice came out with more weight than he'd intended, and he pulled it back, made it quieter. "Let me be here. That's all I'm asking. Let me sit in the chair." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he felt the looking. "Okay," she said finally. He sat. She looked back at the window. They stayed like that for a while, and it was not comfortable. Exactly. It had the texture of something new that hadn't found its shape yet, something that needed more time and more silence to become what it was going to become. But it was real. He was there. She was there. Neither of them was pretending. It was the closest thing to honest they had ever managed in 3 years. At 9, Dr. Mwende came in with the morning blood work results. She gave Ronan a brief evaluating look, the kind that said she had not expected him to still be present and was revising something in her assessment accordingly, and then directed her attention to Laurel in the competent, unperformative way she did everything. The results were improved. Not fixed. Dr. Mwende used that word precisely, and without softening, not fixed. As though she wanted it on record, but the numbers had moved in the right direction overnight. The IV fluids had done what they were supposed to do. Laurel's blood pressure was closer to acceptable. "You can go home tomorrow morning, Doctor," Mwende said, "if this evening's results hold." Under specific conditions. She looked at Laurel over her reading glasses in a way that communicated clearly that these conditions were not negotiable. Twice daily meals. No exceptions for not being hungry. Follow-up blood work in 5 days. A referral to a nutritionist and a therapist, which I am writing into your discharge paperwork, and I want them scheduled before you leave this building. Laurel nodded. "And rest," Dr. Mwende said. "Actual rest. Not whatever you've been calling rest." "I understand." "I'm asking him too." Dr. Mwende looked at Ronan without particular ceremony. "She needs an environment where she's not responsible for managing everything and everyone. I don't know exactly what your household looks like, but I know what ran her down, and it wasn't one bad week." "I understand," Ronan said. Dr. Mwende looked at them both for a moment, with the expression of someone who has said the important things and knows the rest is not in her hands. "Good," she said, and left. The room was quiet. Laurel was looking at her hands in her lap. She had her fingers laced together on the blanket, and she was very still in the particular way she went still when she was thinking something she hadn't decided yet whether to say. "She's right," Laurel said quietly. "I know she is. I mean about me, not about you." She looked up. I let it get here. That was my choice. I kept deciding that whatever was happening with me could wait, and I made that choice over and over, and I need to. She stopped. I need to take responsibility for that. You don't need to take responsibility for anything right now. Yes, I do. That's the problem. Her voice was not sharp, but it had something in it, a firmness, a resistance to being managed even gently. People keep wanting to decide whether I'm a victim of this or responsible for it, and the answer is both. Both things are true at the same time. I let myself disappear into other people's needs because it felt safer than asking for my own to be met. That's on me, she paused. And you dismissed me when I tried. That's on you. He took the hit. He let it land and stayed with it. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her shoulders came down slightly, not relief, exactly, but the particular release that comes when you've said a true and difficult thing and the person across from you doesn't deflect it. I found the letter, he said. Her face changed. The one in your pocket, he said. I shouldn't have read it. I read it anyway. She looked at the window. Her jaw was tight. How much, she said. All of it. The part that was written, he paused. I want to know what the last sentence was supposed to say. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, people right here who would catch you if you let them, she said. That's how it ended. How I wanted it to end. She didn't look at him. I couldn't figure out how to write it without it, sounding like a confession. Is that what it was? Another long silence. Probably, she said. Yes. He had no language ready for that. He sat with it, the weight of it, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of having been told something true by someone who had been carrying it alone for a long time. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He silenced it without looking at it. Laurel noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. The call from Declan came at 11:40, while Ronan was in the corridor outside Laurel's room getting coffee from the vending machine down the hall. We have a name, Declan said. Ronan stood very still with the paper cup in his hand. Tell me, Gareth Sowain. A pause, and in the pause, Ronan heard the specific quality of reluctance that Declan only produced when the information he was delivering was going to cost something significant. He's been on night communications for 8 months. Legitimate access to the scheduling system, the medical emergency log, the external contact directory. Gareth Sowain was 29. He'd been recommended by a previous trusted associate. He'd passed every check they ran. He'd been at the estate long enough to become part of the background, one of those staff members who becomes invisible through competence and consistency. What did he pass to Brennan? Ronan said. The ambulance call, the time, your location. He also accessed the external calendar and the internal briefing schedule 20 minutes after the emergency meeting. While we were all at the hospital or managing lockdown, he was pulling information. He sent a packet. Declan's voice was flat and precise. It went to a cutout, but we traced the chain. Brennan had confirmation of the situation within 3 hours of Laurel being found. Ronan set the coffee cup on top of the vending machine. He thought about the previous afternoon. About Declan telling him Brennan had read the postponement as weakness. About the Kensington corridor arrangement and the intercepted calls and the cascade of consequences that had seemed urgent and large and pressing. He thought about the fact that while he had been sitting in a hospital waiting room with Laurel's journal in his pocket, someone inside his own walls had been packaging that information and moving it to his enemies. Where is he now? Ronan said. A state day rotation. He doesn't know we've identified him. Keep it that way. I'm coming back, Ronan. Declan's voice shifted slightly. There's more. He waited. The packet Sowain sent it wasn't just the emergency details. He sent a summary. Context. Another pause. He described Laurel, her role, her relationship to you, her value, as he used the phrase primary domestic leverage. The corridor was very quiet. Ronan heard the phrase, the way you hear something that reorders the architecture of a situation, not new information exactly, but existing information suddenly reorganized into a shape that was much worse than the one it had been in before. Primary domestic leverage. Laurel, in Gareth Sowain's communication to Connor Brennan, had not been a person. She had been a vulnerability. She had been a vector. She'd been the soft side of a man who everyone assumed had no soft sides, identified and packaged and transmitted to the person most likely to use it. How long has Sowain been feeding information? Ronan said. We're still pulling logs, but based on the access pattern, minimum 4 months, possibly 6. 4 to 6 months. The same window as the escalation in Laurel's journal. The same window during which she'd been getting worse, during which she'd been standing outside his door 7 times and not gotten through, during which the pressure on Ronan's organization had been building in ways he'd attributed to ordinary territorial friction. "Get me everything," he said. "Every communication, every access log, every contact. I want to know who else in the chain was aware, already running it, and Declan." His voice was quiet, and the quieter it got, the more specific its meaning became, which was something Declan had learned to read over a long time. "Nobody touches him until I'm back. Nobody speaks to him. Nobody changes his routine by a single degree. You understand?" Understood. He hung up. He stood in the hospital corridor with the vending machine humming beside him and the paper cup of coffee going cold on top of it, and he felt something move through him that he could not entirely categorize rage. Yes, that was the loudest part, but beneath it, something else. Something seen. Something that had to do with the fact that the person who had been closest to him for 3 years, the person who had watered his orchids and ordered his cinnamon rolls and written him a letter she couldn't finish, had been seen by an enemy operative inside his own house, not as a person with value, but as a tool for his destruction. And the thing that made it worse, the thing that pushed beneath the rage and sat in the dark below it, was that Gareth Soane had not been wrong about the assessment. Ronan had made it accurate. He had treated Laurel as a background element of his life for 3 years. He had dismissed her, talked over her, walked away from her tears, and in doing communicated to every observant person and inside those walls exactly what she was worth to him. He had done Brennan's threat assessment for him. He picked up the coffee, went back to Laurel's room. She was on the phone when he came in. Calls, her sister's voiceover from where it sat. Laurel's side of the conversation clipped in the way conversations go when one person is managing the other person's worry rather than their own. She wrapped it up in under 3 minutes, said, "I'm fine, I'll call you tomorrow, stop," and hung up. She looked at him. "You have to go," she said. "Not a question. Something came up at the estate. I know that face." She said it without heat, without accusation, just plainly. "You don't have to explain it to me. Go handle whatever it is." He stayed where he was, Ronan. She met his eyes. "I'm not going to fall apart if you leave the room. I'm not." She stopped. "Go. Come back when you're done. Come back when you're done." 3 words she'd probably never said to him before. 3 words that assumed, with a quiet confidence, that he would. He stood. He picked up his jacket. He put the stone back in his pocket, and he watched her notice that too. "I'll be back this evening," he said. "Okay," she said. He left. Gareth Soane was in the East Corridor maintenance room at 2:15 p.m., performing the routine systems check that was his legitimate cover for why he was in that part of the estate at that hour, when the door opened and Ronan walked in. Soane looked up. Neutral face. No alarm, because he didn't know there was alarm to have. Then he looked at Ronan's expression. The neutral face became something else. Ronan closed the door. He didn't lock it. He didn't need to. Declan was in the corridor, and 2 others whose presence Soane couldn't see. The architecture of the situation was already complete. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Ronan said. "And then you're going to tell me everything I don't." Soane opened his mouth. "Don't," Ronan said, "not the denial. We're past that. I've got 4 months of access logs, the communication chain to your cutout, and the packet you sent Brennan." He watched the color change in Soane's face, the specific gray that settles over someone when they realize the ground they were standing on is no longer there. "The only decision you have left is how the next hour goes." A sound that systems panel. Soane's back was against the systems. He was young enough that his face didn't have a professional mask, yet whatever he was feeling moved across it without much filter. And what was moving across it now was a rapid, visible calculation followed by the particular stillness of someone who has calculated and found nothing useful. "Who recruited you?" Ronan said. A pause. Then Brennan's man. "A man called Fitz 6 months ago." "What did Fitz offer?" "Money and positioning after." He swallowed. "After things changed." "What things?" He said. Someone stopped. He said Brennan was moving on the Kensington arrangement, that it was going to happen regardless, that having a man on the inside would matter after the transition. He said it in the careful way of someone reciting a thing they'd been told rather than something they'd reasoned themselves, which told Ronan everything about how the recruitment had been framed. "So you believed Brennan had already won," Ronan said. Soane said nothing. "You looked at what you thought was the winning side," Ronan continued. And you made a calculation about which way to stand. He paused. That's a human thing to do. It doesn't make it less of a betrayal, but I understand the arithmetic. Soane looked at him with something uncertain. He saying he couldn't out where this was going, and the not knowing was more frightening than a known outcome would have been. The packet you sent, Ronan said. The one that described Laurel. Soane went very still. Tell me exactly what Fitz asked for. He said Brennan needed to understand your vulnerabilities, not just operational, personal. He was talking faster now, the words coming out with the pressure of someone who has decided that cooperation is the only remaining option. He asked specifically about anyone close to you, personal relationships, people you'd react to if something happened to them. And you identified Laurel. He stopped. She was visible. She was everywhere. Anyone on the property knew she was. He stopped again. That I'd what? Ronan said quietly. Soane's jaw worked. That you'd fall apart if something happened to her, he said. That's what Fitz said. That she was the lever. The room was very quiet. Ronan stood with his hands at his sides, and he thought about a woman lying unconscious on a wooden bench, surrounded by orchids. And he thought about the specific phrase, primary domestic leverage, and he thought about the fact that an enemy operative had correctly identified the most important person in his life before Ronan himself had. He breathed. Did Brennan plan to move on her directly, he said. Was there a plan to use her? Soane's face went a shade grayer. I was passing information. I wasn't part of the operational side. Yes or no? A pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm the answer. I don't know specifics, Soane said, but Fitz asked about her routine, her schedule, where she went off the property. There it was. There was the shape of it. Ronan turned toward the door. Declan, he said. The door opened. Declan came in and behind him one of the others. Soane's posture changed a compressive, involuntary pulling inward. Take him to the south room, Ronan said. Full isolation. Nothing in, nothing out until I say otherwise. And the Brennan situation? Declan asked. I'll handle that tonight. He was already at the door. Get me Fitz's contact information from whatever Soane has. And get me Marcus. Marcus Cho was Ronan's attorney. He was also, among other things, the man who had navigated the previous federal inquiry with a combination of technical precision and strategic patience that had resulted in no charges and a very inconvenient number of sealed documents. Declan nodded once. He understood the shape of what was being assembled. Marcus arrived at the estate at 5 p.m. and found Ronan in the main study with 4 separate folders on the desk and the surveillance backup drive from the East Corridor on the table beside them. Marcus was 51, Korean American, and had a face that gave nothing away with such consistency that Ronan had sometimes wondered whether the neutrality was practiced or structural. He sat down. He looked at the folders. He looked at the drive. Tell me what you have, he said. Ronan told him. Marcus listened without interrupting. He had a particular quality of listening focused as cataloging, without the performative nodding that less skilled people used to signal comprehension. When Ronan finished, Marcus sat for a moment with his fingertips pressed together. The leak establishes that Brennan was gathering intelligence with the specific intent of identifying personal leverage, Marcus said. That's preliminary to an action. Combined with the repositioning around Kensington and the documented communication chain, he paused. This is actually useful. How? Because it creates a record. Brennan has been operating under the assumption that he can apply pressure without consequence because his moves have been technically insulated. If he's got documentation in his possession that outlines a plan to use a civilian as leverage, Marcus picked up one of the folders. That changes the landscape. I want him stopped, Ronan said, permanently, without escalation. I don't want a war that brings attention. I want him paralyzed. Marcus looked at him over the folder. That's a specific ask. I know what I'm asking. You want it legal. I want it complete, Ronan said. Legal where possible, ironclad where not. But Laurel is not to be within 10 miles of whatever this becomes. Nothing touches her. Marcus set the folder down. He looked at Ronan with the particular attention he reserved for moments when a client was telling him something that mattered beyond the immediate legal question. She's important to you, he said. Not a question. Not a judgment. That's not relevant to the brief. It's relevant to the risk assessment. Marcus was steady. Because if Brennan has identified her as leverage and you respond by going at him directly, the first thing he does is move toward her. That's the logic of leverage. The moment you challenge it, the threat escalates. He paused. If she's important to you, the safest thing for her is a strategy that removes Brennan's ability to act before he realizes his intelligence has been compromised. Ronan looked at him. That requires timing, Marcus continued, and it requires Brennan not to know what's coming until it's already arrived. He picked up the drive. This might be enough. The communication chain, the recruitment documentation, the nature of what Soane was asked to collect if there's a federal angle, which given the interstate nature of Brennan's organization, there certainly is. This could be the kind of information that makes things very complicated for him without you having to do anything that leaves a mark on you. You're talking about a report. I'm talking about a very carefully structured, strategically timed conversation with the right people, Marcus said, which is something I can facilitate through channels that don't lead back to you and can't be characterized as cooperation in any legally meaningful way. He set the drive down. But I need 48 hours to look at what you have. You have it. Marcus started gathering the folders. One more thing, Ronan said. Marcus looked up. The woman he identified. Laurel. Ronan paused. She's being discharged from the hospital tomorrow morning. I need her security footprint doubled, without her knowing it's doubled. Nothing that makes her feel surveilled. Nothing that changes her daily life in any visible way. He paused. She's been managed enough. I won't add to that. Marcus studied him for a moment. That's a delicate brief, he said. I know. I'll need to coordinate with Declan. He's expecting your call. Marcus stood, tucked the folders under his arm, and picked up his bag. He was halfway to the door when he stopped. You've been running this organization for 20 years, he said, without turning around. I've known you for 14 of them. I've seen you respond to a lot of threats. Ronan waited. This is the first time, Marcus said, that I've seen you treat someone who isn't you as the thing worth protecting most. He paused. It changes the calculus, in ways that are on balance more favorable to you than the old calculus was. He opened the door. I'll call you in the morning. He left. Ronan sat alone in the study. Outside the window, the estate was in full dark. The grounds were lit by the low security lighting, the perimeter intact, the night rotation in place, the ordinary machinery of containment operating as it had for years. Inside those walls, Gareth Soane was in isolation with whatever he was sitting with. The surveillance logs were being compiled. The communication chain was being documented. And in a hospital 40 minutes away, Laurel was probably awake, probably lying in the dark, looking at the ceiling, probably thinking about everyone except herself. Ronan put on his jacket. He picked up the stone. He got in the car. He had told her he would be back that evening. And there was a version of himself, the old version, the one who measured his word against his schedule and adjusted the word accordingly, who would have called ahead to explain that circumstances required him elsewhere, that he would see her tomorrow, that she would understand. That version of himself had already done enough damage. He drove to the hospital. The night nurse at the floor station looked at him with the particular expression of someone seeing something they hadn't expected. She's awake, the nurse said. She hasn't been sleeping well. I know, Ronan said. He walked down the corridor. He pushed open the door. Laurel was sitting up in the dim room, her knees pulled to her chest under the blanket, her face turned toward the window, and whatever darkness was outside it. She turned when she heard the door. Her face did the thing the composure reflex started, and then she saw who it was and it stopped, and she simply looked at him. You came back, she said. I said I would. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read and very honest. People say a lot of things, she said quietly. He crossed the room and sat in the chair. I know, he said. I've said a lot of things. She was quiet. He reached into his jacket pocket and put the stone on the table beside her, and this time he didn't pull his hand back immediately. He left it there on the table for a moment, close to hers, not touching, just present. There's something I need to tell you, he said. About what happened today. About the estate. He paused. About something I found out that involves you. Laurel lowered her knees slowly from her chest. She straightened against the pillow. She looked at him with the full attention. She gave everything the same attention she'd given every person who'd needed something from her for 3 years, while no one gave it back. Okay, she said. And Ronan For the first time in 20 years of running an organization built on the principle that information was power, and power meant never showing your hand, began to tell someone the truth about all of it, not because strategy required it, not because it served a purpose, but because she was sitting across from him in a hospital bed and she deserved to know, and because the man who would have kept it from her to protect his own control over the situation was a man he had decided in the East Corridor maintenance room that afternoon he was no longer going to be. Laurel listened without interrupting. That was the first thing. He noticed she didn't fill the silences, didn't reach for the reassuring word, didn't do what he'd watched her do 100 times with other people, which was absorb their discomfort before they'd fully expressed it. She sat with her knees folded sideways now, the blanket across her lap, both hands flat on the bed, and she listened to him the way someone listens when they understand that what they're being told is going to require them to be fully present for all of it. He told her about Soane, about the access logs and the communication chain and the packet that had gone to Brennan. He told her about Fitz and the recruitment and the 6 months of information flowing out of the estate's walls to the man who'd been reading the Kensington postponement as opportunity. He told her what Soane had said about her routine, her schedule, where she went off the property. When he said that part, something moved through her face, a rapid involuntary thing, there and gone. Not fear, exactly. Something more complicated. The specific expression of a person who has just understood that a danger they didn't know existed had been closer than they'd realized for longer than they'd known. He told her about Marcus and the strategy taking shape. Then he stopped. She looked at the window for a moment. The darkness outside was complete and flat, the hospital parking lot lights making a thin orange border at the bottom edge of the glass. "How long has he been positioned around Kensington?" she said. He looked at her. "That's the first thing you're asking. I'm asking it in order." She turned back to him. "How long?" "Marcus thinks he's been maneuvering for 3 to 4 months. The active recruitment of Soane was 6 months ago, but the operational positioning is more recent." She nodded slowly, processing. "And the leak Soane specifically, he's the only one? As far as we can confirm. Marcus is running a full audit. What happens to him?" Ronan was quiet for a moment. "He stays isolated until the Brennan situation is resolved. After that depends on what the audit finds, about what else he may have passed." Laurel looked at her hands on the blanket. Specific quality of stillness when she was thinking through something structural, not passive stillness, but the stillness of a mind working quickly underneath a quiet surface. "He knew my schedule," she said. "My off-property movements." "Yes, which means someone was watching me move. Not just noting it in a log, actually watching." "Possibly." "That's a yes, Ronan." He held her gaze. "Yes." She breathed out through her nose. Slowly, "How long before Marcus can move?" He said 48 hours to assess what we have. If the federal angle is viable, the timeline compresses significantly. And if it's not viable, then we use other leverage. He said it plainly, without softening the implication, because she had asked for the truth and she was going to get it. She absorbed that. "The most important thing right now," he said, "is that you're not going back to the estate until the perimeter has been comprehensively reviewed and the security footprint around you specifically has been restructured." Something shifted in her expression. "You mean watched," she said. "Protected. Those aren't always different things." "I know." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "I'm not going to manage you. I'm telling you what's happening, because you have a right to know what's happening. What you do with that is yours." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." She picked up the stone from the table, turned it over in her palm once, set it back down. "Get some sleep," he said. "You're one to talk. I'll sleep in the chair." She looked at the chair, at him, Ronan, Laurel. A pause. "The chair is terrible," she said. "You'll ruin your back." "My back is already ruined." She almost smiled. It was small, incomplete, and absolutely real. He settled into the chair. Outside, the hospital continued its quiet night business. Inside the room, the monitor beeped at its steady intervals. After a while, Laurel's breathing deepened and evened out, and Ronan sat in the chair with his eyes open and his phone face down in his lap, and the stone on the table between them catching the monitor's pale blue light. He did not sleep, but he stayed. A sound like green wood splitting, Marcus called at 6:43 the following morning, and his voice had not slept and had found something while awake that changed the shape of what he'd been working on. Ronan was in the corridor outside Laurel's room. He'd come out when the phone vibrated so the sound wouldn't wake her. "Tell me," he said. "The communication chain goes further than Soane," Marcus said. "You need to hear this carefully." A pause. "Fitz the man Brennan used to recruit Soane. He's not just a Brennan operative. He's been active across 3 separate organizations over the past 18 months. He's a contractor. Freelance intelligence work for whoever's paying." What does that mean for us? It means the information Soane passed didn't only go to Brennan. There's a secondary recipient in the chain. Someone who paid for the same intelligence package independently. Ronan went very still against the corridor wall. "Who?" he said. "A man named Donald Crew." Another pause. "He's been operating quietly out of the Baltimore corridor for 2 years. He's not a primary player, he's never tried to be, but he's been accumulating territory, information, operational capacity, and what he's been accumulating it in the direction of is you." Ronan knew Crew's name, peripherally, the way you know the names of things that haven't yet required your direct attention. He'd been in the background of several situations, not a party to them, but adjacent. An observer. Crew knew about Laurel, Ronan said. Crew paid specifically for information about her, Marcus said. He paid more for it than Brennan did. The corridor was very quiet. A nurse passed with a cart, wheels squeaking on the linoleum. Ronan watched her go without seeing her. "What's his intent?" he said. "I don't know yet. But a man who pays a premium for detailed intelligence about a specific civilian connected to you, including her routine and off-property movements, has a specific use in mind for that intelligence." Marcus's voice was careful. "Ronan. He has a 14-month head start on whatever he's planning. We've been looking at Brennan as the threat. Crew is the threat we didn't see. Get me everything on Crew. Everything. I want his full operational picture on my desk before noon. I'm already building it." A pause. "One more thing. Fitz the contractor. I've located him. He's in Philadelphia. Doesn't know we've traced the chain." Ronan processed that. "Keep him where he is," he said. He hung up. He stood in the corridor for exactly 12 seconds. He counted them. A habit from the years when 12 seconds of stillness before a decision had saved him from a number of decisions he would have regretted. And then he called Declan. "I need 4 people. Reliable, quiet. No history with Crew or Brennan. I need Fitz contained, not harmed, contained within the next 2 hours. And I need the full perimeter of Laurel's movements for the past 6 months, cross-referenced against anything we have on Crew's known operatives." He paused. "And I need you to move the discharge plan. She doesn't go back to the estate today." Declan was quiet for a moment. "Where does she go?" Ronan thought. "The Hartwell property. Outside the city. It's off-book. No connection to the organizational infrastructure. And the security is independent. She'll ask questions." "I know." He looked at Laurel's door. "I'll handle that." He went back into the room. Laurel was awake. She was sitting up, and she had the expression of someone who had heard the tenor of a phone conversation without being able to hear the words, and had drawn accurate conclusions from the tenor alone. "How bad?" she said. "There's a second party," he said. "Someone who paid for the same intelligence package Brennan received. Someone who's been building towards something for longer." She absorbed this with the kind of steadiness that he was beginning to understand was not the absence of fear, but the discipline of someone who had learned that reacting to fear before you have full information was expensive. "What do you need me to do?" she said. "I need you to go somewhere other than the estate when they discharge you. Where? A property outside the city. Secure, isolated, nothing that connects to the organization." He paused. "I'll be there." She looked at him. "You'll be there." "Yes." A long pause. "Ronan." Her voice was careful. "You have 2 active threats. A leak you've just partially closed, a fractured arrangement around Kensington, and a contractor somewhere in Philadelphia who knows more about my routine than I'm comfortable with." She held his gaze. "You can't also babysit me in a safe house. That's not what I do." "It is, though. Not unkind, direct. I'm not fragile. I'm not going to be the reason you're in the wrong place when this escalates." "You're already the reason everything is in motion," he said. "That's not a complaint. That's the situation." She was quiet. "Let me work from the Hartwell property," he said. "I'm not sidelining myself. I'm changing where the center of operations is." He met her eyes. "I work better when I'm not when I know where you are." She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. They moved her at 10 a.m. Not in a hospital discharge vehicle, not in any car connected to the Ashcombe Estate's registered fleet. A clean vehicle, plates unconnected to anything, a driver Declan had used before and trusted with his own life. Roan sat in the back with Laurel, and the drive out of the city was quiet. The October morning putting itself together outside the windows, with the gray-gold light of a season in the process of ending. Laurel looked out the window. She had a bag small, the things Mavis had brought to the hospital on her lap, and her hands were on it, and she was thinking. He could tell she was thinking because of the vertical line between her brows that appeared even when she was doing it quietly, the one that had been present even in sedated sleep. Tell me about Crew, she said. Later now. I need to understand the shape of it. He looked at the back of the driver's. He looked at the back of the driver's head. The driver had the professional deftness of someone who had been selected specifically for it. He's been operating in Baltimore for 2 years, Ronan said, low. Quiet accumulation, territory, information capacity. He's not a frontal assault kind of operator. He works around the edges. He's patient, she said, yes. That's more dangerous than Brennan. Yes. She turned from the window, and he paid specifically for information about me. Yes, she held his gaze. Why, what's his theory about me? Same theory Soane had, that you're the lever. Something moved through her face. And if he tests the lever, he won't get the chance, Ronan said. She looked at him steadily. That's not a plan, she said. That's a wish. The plan is Marcus and the federal angle and Fitz. Crew doesn't move while his intelligence network is being dismantled underneath him. He paused. We have a window. How wide? Wide enough, Ronan. Her voice dropped, went direct. Don't give me the version you'd give Declan. I'm asking you straight. He looked at her. 48 hours, he said. Maybe less if Marcus moves fast. If the federal angle holds, Brennan gets neutralized, and Crew loses his operational partner. Without Brennan, the Kensington play falls apart, and Crew has no shield. And if the federal angle doesn't hold, then it gets more complicated. She held his gaze for a long moment, and he held hers, and in the space between them was the specific truth of the situation, that it was uncertain, that he was moving as fast and as carefully as he knew how to move, that there were variables he couldn't yet see, and she did not look away from any of it. Okay, she said. Okay. She turned back to the window. The Hartwell property was a converted farmhouse 40 minutes outside the city, not large, not obviously fortified. The kind of place that looked like a private family residence, because that was what it had been before Ronan acquired it, through a holding company 6 years ago for exactly this kind of operational contingency. The security was embedded rather than visible, sensors in the tree line, cameras that looked like porch fixtures, a comm system disguised as a standard residential network. Laurel walked through it once without comment. She opened a few doors, looked out the windows, checked the kitchen with the professional attention of someone assessing what she'd have to work with. The pantry's half empty, she said. I'll have Declan. I can make a list. She was already opening cabinets. I'm not an invalid. I can write down what the kitchen needs. Making a shopping list is not going to kill me, Ronan. She turned around and looked at him with a kind of patient exasperation. I will sit down when I'm tired. I will eat on schedule. I will take whatever the doctor prescribed at the times she said to take them. But I am not going to lie on a couch and stare at the ceiling while you solve everything without me, because that's not who I am, and you don't actually want that. You want me present and functional, not wrapped in cotton. He looked at her. She looked back. Fine, he said. Good. She turned back to the cabinets. He almost smiled. Managed not to. Marcus arrived at 2 p.m. with 3 folders, a laptop, and the look of a man who had been awake for 36 hours and was running on the specific fuel of a person who has found something important and needs to finish working on it before they can stop. They set up in the farmhouse dining room, Ronan, Marcus, and Declan, on a secure call from the estate. Laurel sat at the far end of the table with a cup of tea and her own notepad, and nobody suggested she leave, and she didn't offer to. The federal angle is viable, Marcus said. More than viable. The communication chain constitutes documented evidence of interstate conspiracy, which brings it under federal jurisdiction. The nature of what Brennan was planning, specifically the targeting of a civilian for leverage, adds an element that federal prosecutors find particularly useful. He opened the first folder. What I need is someone willing to have a conversation with the right people. Off the record through the right channel. A conversation that makes certain documents available without those documents being attributable to you. You have a channel, Ronan said. I have a channel. Marcus's expression was precise. It's been inactive for 3 years. The person on the other end is still in place and still has reason to want Brennan's operation examined. He paused. But activating that channel requires a specific offer of information they've been looking for that is unrelated to our current situation. What information? Marcus looked at him steadily. The whereabouts of a man called Victor Hale. Ronan was quiet. Victor Hale was not a person Ronan discussed openly. He was a thread from 12 years ago, a situation that had required containment, and the containment had involved relocating certain information to certain places. Ronan knew where Hale was. He had known for 8 years and had kept that knowledge as the kind of insurance policy you hold and never expect to use. If I give them Hale, Ronan said, that opens a line of inquiry that has secondary connections to. I know, Marcus said. I've mapped the exposure. The secondary connections are manageable. The statute of limitations on 2 of the 3 has run. The third is defensible with the right framing. He met Ronan's eyes. It's not a clean trade, but it stops Brennan. It neutralizes Crew's operational support, and it does it within 48 hours. Ronan looked at the table. Declan's voice came from the laptop speaker. It's also the option that keeps the situation from going physical. If we don't move through Marcus's channel, the next move is direct confrontation with Brennan and Crew simultaneously, which is a two-front problem on a compressed timeline. Ronan looked at the window. Outside, the October afternoon was cooling fast, the light thinning toward evening. A line of trees at the property's edge. The sensor lights not yet triggered, the perimeter holding. He thought about the two-front problem. He thought about the arithmetic of it, the resources required, the exposure, the noise. He thought about Laurel at the far end of the table with her tea and her notepad, and about a man called Crew who had paid a premium for her schedule. He thought about the version of himself that would have held Hale's location indefinitely, protecting the asset. Running the risk calculation over and over because releasing any piece of leverage felt like diminishment. That version of himself had also watched surveillance footage of a woman pressing her palm against his door and walking away alone. "Make the call," he said. Marcus nodded. He picked up his phone and stood, and went to the other end of the room, and began speaking quietly in a way that was not intended to be heard. Declan said from the laptop, "Fitz is contained. Our people have him in a location outside the city. He's cooperative. He'd rather deal with us than with whoever he'd otherwise be explaining himself to." "What does he know about Crew's operational timeline?" Ronan said. "He says Crew was planning to move within the week. He doesn't know the specific target or the method, but the intelligence package he delivered was described as pre-operational, meaning Crew had already made the decision to act and was finalizing details. Within the week. Ronan processed that without letting it show on his face. At the other end of the table, Laurel had stopped writing. She was looking at him. She had heard within the week from Declan's speaker, and she was looking at Ronan with the steady, clear gaze of someone who was doing their own arithmetic and arriving at the same answer he was. "He's going to move on me," she said. "We don't know that specifically. Within the week. Pre-operational. He paid for my schedule." She said it quietly, without drama, the words laid out flat. "He was going to use me to get to you. Either as a threat or she stopped. As a demonstration." Ronan looked at her. "Yes," he said, because she deserved the truth, and he was done deciding what portions of it she could handle. She breathed in slowly through her nose, held it, let it out. "Okay," she said. "Laurel, I'm okay." She pressed both palms flat on the table in the way she did when she was grounding herself. "I'm sitting here. I'm in a secure location. You're handling it." She looked at him. "Tell me what I can do." "Nothing right now." "There has to be something." "There isn't. Right now, the most useful thing you can do is stay in this building and let the next 12 hours happen." She looked at him for a long moment. "You hate that answer too," she said. "Yes," he said, "I do." Something in her face shifted, slightly warmer. "Okay," she said. Marx's call lasted 41 minutes. When he came back to the table, his expression was the closest thing to satisfied that his face seemed capable of producing. "The channel is active," he said. "They want the Hale information confirmed and documented. Once it's in their hands, they move within 24 hours on Brennan's organization. The targeting of a civilian as leverage is exactly the kind of element that accelerates their timeline. He sat. Crew is collateral to Brennan's operation. When Brennan goes, Crew's operational network in this region effectively collapses. He loses his infrastructure and his intelligence sourcing simultaneously. And Crew himself, Ronan said. Without his network, he's a marginal operator. The threat level drops dramatically. Marcus paused. He's not gone, but he's defanged. I want him watched. Already factored in. Declan's voice from the laptop, Ronan. The Brennan intercepts just updated. He's activated something. 2 of his people moved out of position in the last hour. Everyone at the table went still. Toward what? Ronan said. We're tracking. But one of the vectors, a pause, and in the pause something shifted in the room's air. Something tightened. One of the vectors is toward the city. Toward the hospital discharge route. He thought they'd had more time. He'd calculated 48 hours, and Brennan was moving in 20. Ronan was on his feet before Declan finished the sentence. Lock down this property, he said. Full activation. I want everyone on the perimeter now. He looked at Marcus. Call your channel back. Tell them the timeline has moved. We need the federal hold activated tonight. Tell them tonight. Marcus was already on the phone. Ronan turned to Laurel. She was standing. She had her arms folded across her chest. Not defensively, it was the posture she took. She was cold, or when she was thinking hard, and her face was completely calm in the way faces go when a person has passed through the fear and come out the other side into something that is just clear and present and ready. Tell me what you need from me, she said. Stay away from the windows. Stay in the interior rooms. He crossed to her. He was closer than he normally stood, and he looked at her directly, and she looked back. This is going to be resolved tonight. Not because I'm certain of every variable, because I'm not leaving this unfinished with you inside it. She held his gaze. I know, she said. And then quieter, I know you're not. Something in his chest did something complicated and specific that he did not have vocabulary for and did not have time to examine. He turned toward the door. Declan's voice from the laptop again, sharp, Ronan. The second vector. It's not toward the hospital route. Ronan stopped. Where? He said. A pause that lasted 2 seconds and felt like something else entirely. It's moving toward a property outside the city, Declan said. Off book. No organizational connection. Ronan turned back to the room. Marcus had his phone pressed to his ear, his eyes on Ronan, and his face had lost whatever professional neutrality it normally carried, which was the most alarming thing Ronan had seen in the past 48 hours, because Marcus Cho did not lose his professional neutrality. They already knew, Marcus said, and his voice was very quiet. Crew, he fed the Hartwell property to Brennan. He knew the discharge plan. He knew she'd be moved here. He lowered the phone. Ronan. The leak isn't only Soane. The farmhouse dining room was very quiet. A sound setstein of me. The October evening had settled into full dark, and the perimeter sensors that should have been showing green on the monitor Declan had set up were showing something that was not green, and the tree line at the edge of the property was moving in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. And Ronan Ashcombe stood at the center of a room that had just become a location that 2 separate enemies already knew about, with the woman they'd both been targeting sitting 6 feet behind him, and the next 12 seconds were going to require him to be precisely and completely the thing he'd spent his entire life learning how to be. He pulled his phone. He called the number for the 4 people Declan had placed on the perimeter. The first one picked up on half a ring. East tree line, Ronan said. Right now. Already moving, the man said. We've got 3 incoming. Maybe 4. Hold the line. Nothing through the perimeter. Copy. He hung up. He looked at Marcus. Get your channel to move in the next 60 minutes, or this conversation never happened. Marcus was already talking. Ronan turned to Laurel, and she was already standing with the chair between herself and the window, not because anyone had told her to, because she had assessed the room the moment she walked in, and she knew which walls were exterior and which weren't, and the fuzz the real kind, not performed, not suppressed, but present in the specific way of someone who has decided that being afraid is not the most useful thing she can do right now. There's a door at the back of the kitchen, she said. I know. It opens onto the interior utility space, not the exterior. I know. Then why are we still standing here, she said. He looked at her. He almost said something. Several things moved in the version that needed to tell her to go, The version that needed to stay in this room and manage the perimeter. The version that had been making every decision alone for 20 years and did not know the mechanics of making them any other way. Then, one of the exterior sensors triggered and the monitor on the table flashed red, and from somewhere in the tree line, a sound moved through the dark that was not the wind, and Ronan made the only decision that mattered. He moved toward her. "Stay close," he said. "Always have," she said. The kitchen door held for exactly 4 seconds after Ronan pulled it shut behind them. Then the first impact came, not an explosion, not the dramatic rupture of action movies, but a dull structural thud that moved through the farmhouse walls, like something the building had absorbed before and didn't like. Ronan had his hand on Laurel's arm, not gripping, just present, and he felt her flinch at the sunset and then steady herself, and the steadying happened faster than he expected. The utility space was narrow and smelled like old wood and dry earth, a passage between the kitchen and the back storage area that had been part of the original farmhouse structure before the renovation. Low ceiling, one bulb pull cord, which Ronan didn't pull. He had his phone out, screen dimmed to near nothing, the blue light enough to see the shape of the space without broadcasting it. Declan's voice came through the earpiece, "East perimeter holding. We've got 2 contained. 3rd is unaccounted for." "Interior breach?" Ronan said, barely above a whisper. "Negative so far. They hit the sensor line, but the team pushed back. Brennan's people, not Crew's, based on the approach pattern. This is a distraction play." "A distraction play." Ronan looked at Laurel in the near dark. She was looking back at him. She had processed the word distraction at the same speed he had. He could see it in her face, the recognition that if this was a distraction, it meant the real play was somewhere else. And the question was, where? "Crew," he said into the earpiece. "We don't have eyes on Crew directly. But Fitz, before we moved him, he mentioned that Crew had a secondary operative. Someone we haven't identified. Someone with legitimate access to." A pause, and in the pause, something moved through the audio feed that sounded like controlled urgency. "Ronan. Marcus just flagged something. There's a vehicle on the property. Came in from the north access, which is off the sensor grid. It's been there since before we locked down. Since before they'd locked down, which meant it had arrived while they were still setting up. The perimeter was still being established. While someone with knowledge of the property's sensor, layout knowledge that required specific intelligence, not general information, had moved into position using the gap. Crew's secondary operative hadn't come through the tree line with Brennan's people. They were already inside the perimeter. "The north access," Ronan said. "What's the vehicle doing?" "Stationary. Engine off. Parked in the maintenance bay on the north side." "A beat. Ronan. The maintenance bay has an interior access point. It connects to the storage room," Ronan said. The storage room was 12 feet from where they were standing. He turned to Laurel and he didn't speak. He put his hand flat against her sternum, one firm pressure that communicated its stay, and he held up 2 fingers, which she understood without explanation. He took 2 steps toward the storage room door and put his back against the wall beside it and listened. Silence, then a sound. Small, specific. The sound of someone who has been very still for a long time, making a single adjustment to their position. Someone was in the storage room. Ronan ran the calculation in approximately 1 second. He had no weapon in his hand. The space was tight. There was a door between him and whoever was on the other side, and Laurel was 8 feet behind him in a passage with no secondary exit. He looked back at her. She had picked up the only thing in the utility space that constituted an object, a metal shelf bracket, detached from its fitting, about 18 inches long. She was holding it with both hands. Her face was pale and completely focused. He almost told her to put it down. He didn't. He turned back to the door. He hit it with his shoulder at full weight. No hesitation. No countdown. The hesitation before a door was always the thing that cost you. And the door came open and he was through it, and the person on the other side was a man he had never seen before. Mid-40s, compact, who had been positioned near the interior access point, with a phone in one hand that was very clearly a communication device rather than a personal one, and who did not have time to process what was happening before Ronan crossed the feet between them and had his wrist and the phone and the wall all in contact with each other simultaneously. The phone hit the concrete floor. The man hit the wall. He was professional enough not to make a sound. Ronan gave him that. Whatever Crew paid, He'd bought composure, or something that looked like it. "Who else is on this property?" Ronan said. The man looked at him and said nothing. "I'm going to ask once more, and then this stops being a conversation," Ronan said. "No one," the man said. His voice was flat. "Regional American, somewhere Midwest. I was coordinating. If I don't signal in the next 4 minutes, the exterior teams pull back. The exterior teams are already contained." A flicker. The composure developed a hairline fracture. "Signal them," Ronan said. "Tell them to pull back now. Tell them it's done. Crew is the next problem. You are the current problem. Signal them." The man looked at Ronan for a long moment, with the specific calculation of some assessing whether the thing they're afraid of is worse than the thing in front of them. Whatever conclusion he reached it fast. "Give me the phone," he said. Ronan picked the phone off the floor and handed it to him, and watched him send a 3-character code that was apparently the agreed signal for abort. Declan's voice in the earpiece, 30 seconds later. "They're pulling back. East and north perimeters clearing." Ronan exhaled. Controlled. He looked at the man against the wall. "Sit down, on the floor. Hands where I can see them." The man sat. Ronan stepped back into the utility passage. Laurel was still holding the shelf bracket. She lowered it when she saw his face. "Clear," she said. "Clear enough." He looked at the bracket in her hands. "You were going to use that?" "Yes," she said, without apology. "On a trained operative. On whoever came through that door first. That wasn't you." She set the bracket down on the shelf. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear, he thought, but from the adrenaline finding nowhere to go, now that the immediate thing was over. "I've never been the kind of person who waits to be rescued." He looked at her. "I know," he said. Marcus's channel moved in 53 minutes. Ronan would learn the details later, over several days, in pieces because federal operations don't narrate themselves in real time to the people whose information initiated them. They simply move, and you find out what happened in the lag between action and acknowledgement. What he knew that night. Sitting in the farmhouse kitchen at 11 p.m. with Declan on a secure call and Marcus at the table, and Laurel across from him, with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that Ronan had made badly, but she was drinking anyway, was this: Connor Brennan had been taken into federal custody at 9:47 p.m. The documentation, Marcus had provided the communication chain, the recruitment of Soane, splitting. The explicit targeting of a civilian for leverage had given the relevant people everything they needed to move on a timeline that had been waiting for exactly this kind of catalyst. Brennan's operation, insulated as it was, had a specific and well-documented federal exposure that had been building for 18 months. Marcus's channel had simply opened the valve. Brennan was done, which meant the Kensington arrangement was no longer under pressure, because the pressure had been Brennan's alone. The other parties in that arrangement had no particular interest in destabilization. They had simply been waiting to see which way the wind went. Donald Crew was a more complicated conclusion. Without Brennan's operational infrastructure, Crew's reach in the region had been effectively severed. His secondary operative was in Declan's custody. Fitz, the contractor, had been cooperative enough to constitute a documentable record of Crew's intelligence-gathering activities. Marcus was confident carefully, precisely confident, in the way Marcus was confident, about things that Crew understood the position he was now in, and would make the calculation that expansion in this direction was no longer viable. "He's not gone," Marcus said for the second time, "but he has nowhere to go." "I want ongoing monitoring," Ronan said. "Already arranged." Gareth Soane remained in isolation while the full audit ran. The secondary leak, the source of Crew's knowledge of the Hartwell property, turned out not to be a person, but a system, an unpatched vulnerability in the scheduling network that Soane had created and left open deliberately, a back door that had been providing access to anyone who knew it existed. The technical team found it and closed it at midnight. Ronson sat with all of this at the kitchen table and let it settle. Not with satisfaction. The thing about containing a situation was that containment and resolution were not the same, and he had enough experience to know the difference. Brennan was in custody. Crew was diminished. Soane was isolated. The leak was closed. These were facts. Not endings, they were the point at which the immediate crisis had passed, and the longer, quieter work of rebuilding the thing that had been damaged began. Laurel was looking at him over her mug. "You're still running the numbers," she said. "I'm always running the numbers." They're coming out okay, she said. Not a question. Well enough. She nodded. She drank her tea. She had the quality, in that moment, of someone who has been through a significant thing and has not yet decided how to feel about it. Not numbed, not traumatized, but suspended in the honest uncertainty of the immediate aftermath, where the adrenaline is still leaving the body and the meaning of what happened hasn't fully assembled itself yet. I want to go home, she said. He looked at her. Not tonight, he said. Tomorrow. When the estate's been fully reviewed. Tomorrow, she agreed. She slept in the farmhouse's single bedroom. He took the couch, which was worse than the hospital chair, but served the same function: proximity, without imposition, presence without assumption. He didn't sleep much. He sat with the stone on the coffee table in front of him and thought about the sequence of the past 4 days in the way he thought through everything, chronologically, causally, a sound like green wood splitting, looking for the places where different choices would have produced different outcomes. He found them quickly. They were not hard to find. If he had opened his door, if he had turned from his desk 11 months ago when Declan brought him a proposal he hadn't read, if he had looked at Laurel standing in the marble hallway with tears on her face and asked what was wrong, what did she need, what had she been carrying that had gotten too heavy. The version of those events in which Laurel did not end up in a hospital bed was not complicated. It required no particular strategic genius. It required only the decision to look at another person as though they mattered as much as the machinery surrounding them. He had not made that decision. He had made it now. The difference between those two facts was something he intended to sit with for a long time. Not as punishment was another way of making it about himself, but as a reminder with edges. The kind you kept where you could feel it. They went back to the estate the following morning. The estate staff had been notified that Laurel was coming home. Ronan had specifically said, no gathering at the entrance, no production. He knew her well enough now to know that a reception would cost her something, that she would immediately shift into the mode of managing other people's relief, absorbing their concern, and in doing so, spend the first hour home doing exactly what she'd been doing for 3 years. So the entrance was quiet when the car came through the gate. The grounds crew were at their work. The kitchen staff were in the kitchen. Mavis was in the hall, alone, and she looked at Laurel when she came through the door with the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for a thing they were genuinely uncertain would happen. Laurel looked at Mavis. Mavis opened her arms. Laurel went to them and stayed there for a moment, and Ronan watched from the doorway, as something in Laurel's posture, the thing she'd been holding upright since the farmhouse, since the hospital, since long before any of that came down slightly, in the presence of the one person who had known all along. Then Laurel straightened, wiped her face with the back of her hand, looked around the hall with the assessing, instinctive gaze of someone coming home. The east corridor runner, she said to Mavis. It was coming up at the corner when I left. Has anyone fixed, Mavis said, day before yesterday. Laurel nodded, and the groundskeeper with the knee saw a physician on Tuesday. Surgery scheduled for next month. Good. She exhaled. Good. Ronan watched her do it, watched the reintegration happen, the resumption of contact with the details of the place she'd been absent from, and he recognized, this time without the impatience he would have felt 4 days ago, that this was not Laurel reverting to pattern. This was Laurel being Laurel. The caring was not the problem. It had never been the problem. The problem had been that it had been entirely unreciprocated, that she had poured it outward continuously without anyone directing any of it back at her. That was the thing to fix, not who she was. He walked past her in the hall and said, "Come find me when you're ready. No rush." She looked at him with a slightly surprised expression, the surprise of someone who had been bred for a different kind of conversation. "Okay," she said. He went to his office. He left the door open. She came in an hour later. He was at his desk, but not working. He had a folder open that he wasn't reading, which was its own kind of statement. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She was still in the clothes she'd worn from the farmhouse, her hair slightly imprecise in a way that suited her better than the managed version, and she stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame in a posture that was not quite entering and not quite leaving. "You left the door open," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. Then she looked at the office, at the desk, the bookshelves, the windows, The conspicuous absence of any personal photograph or object that had ever made it past his own stringent editorial sense of what the room should contain. She crossed to the chair across from his desk and sat down. Not in the way she usually sat when she was there for estate business, straight-backed, organized, ready to be efficient. She sat the way you sit in a chair when you're tired, and you've decided that the performance of not being tired is something you're done with for the moment. She sat like someone who had earned the right to take up the space. "Talk to me," Ronan said. She looked at him. "About what?" "Whatever you've been thinking since last night that you haven't said yet." A pause. She pressed her lips together briefly. "I keep thinking about Crew," she said. "About the fact that someone I've never met, who has never spoken to me, who doesn't know anything about me beyond a schedule and a set of movement patterns, that he looked at that information and saw a tool." She was quiet for a moment. "I've thought a lot about being invisible, about being the person nobody notices until something needs doing. But I never thought about being visible in that way, as a vulnerability, as something to be used." "You're not a vulnerability. I know that." She met his eyes, but I was positioned as one. By him, by Sowain, and partially by the situation we'd created here. The one where nobody could tell from the outside whether I mattered to you or not. She paused. "Because from the inside, I wasn't sure either." The words landed with the specific weight a true thing said plainly. Ronan looked at her. He did not look away. "You mattered," he said. "You have always mattered. The failure was mine, not in feeling it, but in never making it legible. To you or to anyone else." He paused. "I kept the distance because distance was what I knew how to manage. And I called it discipline. It wasn't discipline. It was avoidance wearing discipline's clothes." She held his gaze for a long moment. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I have a lot of ground to make up." "You do." A pause. "So do I." "You don't." "I do." Her voice was firm, not defensive. "I made myself indispensable so no one would look too closely at whether I was okay. I turned caring for people into a place to hide from caring for myself. That's not your failure. That's mine." She looked at her hands for a moment. "We both built something that worked very well at keeping us from having to be honest with each other." He considered that. "Yes," he said. "I'm not interested in rebuilding it the same way," she said. "Neither am I." She looked up. Something in her face was open, in a way he had not seen it before, not the managed openness she deployed professionally, but the real kind, which had more uncertainty in it and was more difficult to look at directly because of what it asked in return. "What does it look like?" she said. "The different version." He thought about this seriously, because she deserved a serious answer and not a reflexive one. "It looks like you having a physician you actually see. Regularly. Not someday." He paused. "It looks like you telling me when something is wrong before it gets to the point of not being able to stand up." Another pause. "It looks like me asking. So you don't always have to volunteer it." She was quiet. "And from my side," he said, "it looks like the door being open. Not just today, consistently. It looks like he stopped. Started again. I've spent a long time making sure nobody could get close enough to matter. You got close enough anyway. And instead of acknowledging that, I used the distance as a way to avoid what it meant." He looked at her. "I'm done doing that." Laurel looked at him for a long, steady moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She exhaled slowly. Sound like green wood splitting. Some of the tension been carrying the particular tightness across her shoulders that she probably wasn't aware of came down incrementally, and she settled into the chair in a way that was different from how she'd sat in it before. More fully, more present. "I'm going to call my sister back today," she said. "Good. And I'm going to schedule the follow-up blood work. I know you are. And I'm going to—" She stopped. She looked at him with a slight expression of wry acknowledgement. "I'm going to try to stop treating my own needs like they're items on someone else's to-do list." "I'll remind you," he said, "when you forget." She almost smiled. "You'll have to learn to notice when I'm starting to forget." "I'm learning." She looked at him, really looked the kind of looking she did when she was deciding whether something was true or whether it was the version of true that people present when they want to be believed. She looked at him for long enough that he felt it, and then something in her expression settled. "I know you are," she said. The following days moved differently. Not perfectly. There was nothing clean about the mechanics of a household and an organization resuming after a crisis, and Ronan's had not suddenly become a different person in terms of his fundamental architecture. He was still the man who moved through rooms thinking 12 steps ahead, still The man whose first instinct in any situation was strategy rather than feeling, still the man who found sustained emotional availability genuinely difficult, in the way people who have armored themselves against it for decades find it difficult. But the armor had holes in it now, and he was not patching them. The estate staff received their formal notification of the new wellness program on the third day. Declan handled the logistics, but Ronan stood in the main common room when it was announced and said, briefly and without ceremony, that the program existed because it should have existed a year ago, and that anyone who had been managing something alone should know that was no longer necessary. He said it plainly and without the performance of emotion, which was for him the most honest way he knew how to say it. Afterward, two people came to Declan separately with the things they'd been carrying. Mavis found Ronan in the kitchen that evening and told him. He nodded. Two, he said. Two that we know about, Mavis said. He nodded again. The full audit on Gareth Sowain concluded at the end of the week. The technical team confirmed the backdoor he'd created in the scheduling system and documented 4 months of information passage. Marcus, working through channels that remained appropriately indirect, ensured the documentation found its way to the people who could use it most effectively. Sowain's cooperation in the final days of the audit resulted in an arrangement that suited no one perfectly, which was Marcus's standard definition of an acceptable outcome. Victor Hale's whereabouts provided to the federal channel resulted in a quiet resolution to something that had been outstanding for 8 years. Ronas absorbed the secondary exposure Marcus had warned him about and found, as Marcus had predicted, that it was manageable. Not comfortable. Manageable. Connor Brennan did not make bail. Donald Crew, without his network, without Brennan, without an operational toehold in the region, retreated to Baltimore and stayed there. The monitoring Ronan had requested confirmed over the following weeks that Crew was recalibrating, not abandoning his ambitions, but recognizing that the specific play he'd been building toward had closed. The Hartwell property was emptied, secured, and taken off any accessible record. The Kensington arrangement was reconfirmed among its parties within 2 weeks of Brennan's removal, with considerably less friction than it had operated under for the previous 3 months. The organization survived. It continued. It was not the same. Exactly, Ronan had made changes that were structural rather than superficial, and some of those changes were the kind that altered the operational texture of daily life in ways that could not be quietly reversed after the immediate urgency had passed. He had made them publicly enough, through Declan, and through the staff announcement, and through the documented implementation of Laurel's year-old proposal, that reversing them would require a deliberate decision rather than a gradual drift. He was counting on that. 3 weeks after the farmhouse, Ronan found Laurel in the conservatory. It was a Thursday afternoon in late October. The light coming through the glass at the particular angle that made everything inside look suspended in something amber and slow. She was sitting on the wooden bench, the same orchids, but sitting properly, this time, upright, with her old journal open in her lap. She was writing. He stood in the doorway, without announcing himself. He had learned over the past weeks the difference between checking on her and surveilling her, and he had become imperfectly, with occasional corrections from Laurel herself when he got it wrong, better at the former, without sliding into the latter. After a moment, she became aware of him. She looked up. "You could knock," she said. "It's a conservatory. There's no door. There's a conceptual door." He came in and sat beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching and not touching. She didn't shift away from the proximity. Neither did he. She had the journal open to a page he recognized the page with the incomplete entry that had been sitting at the end of the written record like an open wound. "Schedule my own appointment." It was crossed out now. Underneath it, in the careful handwriting she used when something needed to be permanent, "Keep every promise I make to myself." He read it without comment. Then he held out his hand. She looked at his hand. Then at him. She gave him the pen. He wrote beneath her sentence, "You never have to carry tomorrow alone again." She read the words. He watched her read them, watched her eyes move across them once, then again watched whatever was happening in her face as she sat with the weight of them. Her eyes filled. She didn't wipe them immediately. She sat with that too, and he sat beside her, and for once there was nothing in him that wanted to categorize what he was looking at as inconvenient or poorly timed or something that required management. He stayed. I want to tell you something, she said. Her voice was slightly rough. Tell me. When I was lying in the conservatory, she paused. I mean, when I collapsed before the ambulance. I don't remember much of it, but I remember there was a moment right at the beginning when I was sitting on this bench and the room was doing that thing it does when you're about to go, and I thought, she stopped again. What did you think? He said. She looked at the orchids in front of them. They were doing well. She'd resumed caring for them 6 days after returning. Gradually, the way she did everything, not rushing back to the old pace, but returning deliberately, on her own terms. I thought, someone's going to come looking, she said. I actually believed that. Even then. Even after everything. She looked at him. I don't know if that's pathetic or it's not pathetic. I kept showing up for people who didn't always show up for me, and I kept believing it would change. She exhaled. That's either very stubborn or very stupid. It's neither. He held her gaze. It's the thing that kept you here long enough for me to figure out what I was losing. She was quiet. I'm sorry, he said. For the hallway. For the things I said in front of people who had no business hearing them. For 3 years of doors I didn't open. He said it without ceremony, without the self-protective qualifications that apologies become when the person giving them is more interested in being forgiven than in the act of acknowledgement itself. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. Not, it's okay. Not, don't worry about it. Not any of the deflecting, softening, self-erasing responses she would have given 6 weeks ago to avoid the discomfort of being apologized to by someone whose good opinion she'd been working to maintain. Just, I know. It was, he thought, one of the more significant things he had ever heard. The cinnamon rolls became a permanent line item. Laurel put them on the standing supply order herself, from the bakery 40 minutes out, which Ronan discovered when he saw the invoice and noted the frequency had increased from occasional to weekly. He went to find her about it and found her in the kitchen. On a Saturday morning, the roll already on a plate, coffee made the way he liked it, sitting at the kitchen table across from an empty chair. She looked up when he came in. Her expression was the particular one she had when she was being deliberately casual, about something she'd done with intent. He sat down. He picked up the coffee. You could have told me, she said, any time in the last 3 years that you liked them. You could have told me you were ordering them. I liked not telling you. She broke off a piece of her own roll. It felt like having something that was just mine. Something I knew about you that wasn't organizational. He looked at her. Is that strange, she said. No, he said. It's not strange. He broke the roll in half and slid the larger half across the table toward her. She looked at it. That's mine, he said, the smaller one. You're giving me the bigger piece. You need the calories more than I do. That's I'm doing fine now. The blood work was Laurel. She looked at him. He looked back. She picked up the larger half. They sat in the kitchen in the October morning light that came through the windows of the estate at an angle that made the room look warmer than the season suggested. A sound like green wood splitting, and they ate the cinnamon rolls that had been ordered from 40 minutes away because she had noticed once that he'd eaten one twice, and the domesticity of it was so ordinary and so specific that Ronan sat in the middle of it and let himself feel the full weight of what it would have cost him to lose it. He had spent his life in rooms where the stakes were high and the costs were legible money, territory, safety, power. He understood those currencies. He knew how to calculate what a loss in those terms meant and what recovery required. He had not understood until recently that there were other currencies entirely. Splitting. That a person who brought you coffee when you forgot to eat and ordered flowers for someone having a hard week and spent 3 years trying to find the right moment to tell you that you didn't have to carry everything alone, that losing that person, or losing the possibility of what they were trying to offer, was a cost that would not appear on any ledger he knew how to read. He knew how to read it now. Laurel's physician appointment was on a Wednesday, 4 weeks after her discharge. She went alone. She had been specific about this, not a production, not an escort, just a Wednesday morning appointment, like a person with a life that included taking care of themselves went to. Ronan didn't argue. He noted the time in his own calendar without telling her, which was as close as he could get to restraint on the subject. She came back at noon. She found him in the study. Well, he said, which was not the casual tone he'd intended. Well, she sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair, but differently now. Always differently now. My numbers are improving. She wants to see me again in 6 weeks. I have a prescription for the vitamin deficiency, which I have already filled, in case that was going to be your next question. It was, I know. She looked at him with a slight smile. She also recommended continuing with the counseling. Good. I made the next appointment before I left the building. He looked at her. You're surprised, she said. I'm no. He paused. I thought you might resist it. I thought so too. She folded her hands in her lap, looked at them for a moment. But she said something in the first session that I've been thinking about. She said that people who spend their lives being emotionally available to others often have the hardest receiving the same. That the generosity isn't the problem. It's the belief underneath it that they don't quite deserve the same return. She said it plainly, looking at the bookshelf rather than at him. And he said, and I think she's right. She looked at him. I've been doing a lot of things out of a belief that if I was useful enough, present enough, indispensable enough, someone would eventually see that and decide I was worth the same effort. She paused. That's not a healthy model. No, he said, I'm working on a different one. She met his eyes. It's slower. It requires me to actually say what I need instead of hoping someone reads it in the subtext. A pause. It requires me to believe I'm worth saying it. You are, he said. I know. She said it without the deflection, without the qualifying hedge. I'm getting better at knowing it. He looked at her for a moment. What do you need, he said, right now? She blinked. It was a small blink, the blink of someone ambushed by a direct question they've been waiting a long time for. Lunch, she said. I haven't eaten since this morning. Then we should eat lunch. You have a call at 1. I'll move it. She looked at him. You don't have to. Laurel. He said her name the way he'd learned to say it, not as a conversation ender, but as a complete sentence, as the thing itself. Let me move the call. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. They ate lunch in the kitchen. Mavis had made soup earlier in the week, the real kind, from scratch, with properly cut vegetables, and there was enough left. They heated it. They sat at the table. The October light came through at its flat afternoon angle, and the estate made its ordinary sounds around them, the sounds of a large household in the middle of a weekday, unhurried and specific and real. Laurel talked about her sister, who had called twice since the hospitalization, and who was, in Laurel's assessment, handling her relief by converting it into unsolicited wellness advice. Listened. He didn't offer solutions. When she paused, he asked the question, not the extractive kind of question he asked in meetings, but the kind of question that said, I'm still here. Keep going. She noticed. She talked for longer than she'd intended. He could tell there was a point where she caught herself and started to apologize for it, and he shook his head once, and she stopped apologizing and kept talking. After a while the soup was gone, and the afternoon had moved past the kitchen window, and neither of them had noticed. I want to expand the program, Laurel said. She had her hands around a glass of water, turning it slightly. The wellness program. What Declan implemented. Tell me, he said. The counseling's access is there, but people don't know how to use it. The confidentiality provision needs to be clearer. I think people are still afraid it loops back to management. She looked at him. It needs to be genuinely off-book. An independent provider with no reporting relationship to the estate. Just access, arrange it, he said. Just like that. You've been thinking about this longer than 5 minutes, he said. You had it right the first time, a year ago. Arrange it the way it should have been arranged then. She looked at him with an expression that was warm and slightly complicated, the expression of someone receiving something they'd given up expecting. Okay, she said. She picked up her notepad from the counter. She always had a notepad somewhere close. It was one of the unvarying facts of her, and she wrote something down. Then she looked at the list for a moment, and she crossed one line off and wrote another beneath it, and something about the gesture was so specifically recognizably her that Ronan felt it somewhere behind his sternum. What are you crossing off? He said. She turned the notepad toward him. The line she'd crossed off read, figure out if asking is worth it. The line beneath it read ask. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. She looked back, steady and clear and present, the woman who had watered his orchids and carried his coffee and stood outside his door 7 times and pressed her palm flat against the wood and walked away, who had collapsed among the flowers she tended while thinking about him, who had listened to him tell her the truth about everything in a dim hospital room and responded by asking what she could do to help the woman who had never stopped showing up, even when showing up had cost her more than anyone around her understood. For what it's worth, he said, it was always worth it. She held his gaze, a long moment. Then she picked up the pen, and beneath both lines she wrote one more thing and turned the notepad back toward him. It is. Outside, the October afternoon was doing its last work on the trees, stripping the final leaves, clearing the branches down to their essential shapes, leaving the landscape honest and undecorated and ready for whatever came next. Inside the kitchen of the Ashcombe estate, two people sat with empty soup bowls and a notepad between them and the specific, unspectacular piece of a thing that had been broken and was being slowly and imperfectly, and without any guarantee, put back together. Ronan Ashcombe had built his life on the certainty that power meant never needing anything you couldn't provide yourself. He had been wrong about that for a long time. He was done being wrong about it. Laurel Fenwick had built her life on the certainty that being needed was the closest thing to being loved that she could safely ask for. She was learning slowly that it was not the same thing at all, and that the real thing, the harder and more honest thing, was available to her if she could learn to stay in the room when it was offered, instead of deflecting it back toward whoever had offered it. Neither of them would get it right every day. They were not those kinds of people, and this was not that kind of story. But they were in the kitchen. The soup was gone. The afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in late October, honest and golden, and running out. And neither of them was leaving the room.